From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Okay, why don't we get started? I have, at the request of Josh, I have a brief announcement that all the only open and unlocked restrooms are by the registration desk, so you shouldn't freak out if you encounter a locked one. And I don't know if he's here. He's probably putting out fires somewhere, but I think I also wanted to mention that if you see him today, to acknowledge the amazing amount of work that he's done to put together not just this one, but the previous task force conference and all the amazing stuff that we're encountering here. I don't know about you, but as you can hear, I definitely have conference voice, right, which tells me that there were lots of good conversations that were had. So I'm Alex Russo. I teach at the Catholic University of America, and I'm incredibly humbled to share this stage with two scholars, right, who have defined radio studies for the past 30 years. I would imagine that every person in this room has been influenced by their work in one way or another. To introduce them in alphabetical order, Susan Douglas is the Catherine Neefe Kellogg Professor and Arthur Turnow Professor of Communication Studies at the University of Michigan. She's the author of 5 books, most recently Enlightened Sexism, The Seductive Message That Feminism's Work Is Done, in 2010, The Mommy Myth, The Idealization of Motherhood and How It Undermines Women, with Meredith Michaels, in 2004, Listening In, Radio in the American Imagination, from 1999, which won the Hacker Prize in 2000 for the best popular book about technology and culture, Where the Girls Are, Growing Up Female in the Mass Media, in 1994, and Inventing American Broadcasting, 1899 to 1922, in 1987. She has written and appeared on a wide variety of popular publications and radio and television programs. She served on the board of the George Foster Peabody Awards from 2005 to 2011, I think, and in 2010 was selected as chair of the board. She is the 2009 recipient of the Leonardo da Vinci Prize, the highest honor given by the Society for the History of Technology to an individual who has greatly contributed to the history of technology through research, teaching, publications, and other activities. Michelle Hilms is Emeritus Professor in the Department of Communication Arts at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her work focuses on media history and historiography, particularly in the areas of transnational media and sound studies. She's the author of 4 books, Network Nations, a transnational history of British and American broadcasting, the most recent. Also, Radio Voices, American Broadcasting, 1922 to 1952 and 1997. Hollywood and Broadcasting, Radio to Cable in 1990, and the standard textbook in the history of American broadcasting, Only Connect, which is now in its 4th edition as of 2013. She is also the editor or co-editor of Radio's New Wave, Global Sound in the Digital Era, with Jason Levilio in 2013, NBC, America's Network in 2007, the Television History Book in 2003 with Jason Jacobs, Connections, a Broadcast History Reader, 2002, and the Radio Reader, also with Jason Levilio, in 2001. She was the 2013 and 14 Fulbright Research Scholar at the University of Nottingham, and this year she was the recipient of the Distinguished Career Award from the Society for Cinema and Media Studies. So I know we all want to hear what these folks would like to say, so I think they're going to speak for 15 minutes or thereabouts, and then we'll open the floor up for discussion. So.
Great. Thank you, Alex. I, too, want to thank Josh Shepard, the extraordinary conference director, for putting together such an amazing gathering, really, that brings people together from different yet deeply interdependent professions who all have that radio gaga spirit and rely so crucially on each other. There aren't enough conferences that bring together practitioners, archivists, educators, and scholars. So kudos to Josh for organizing this amazing gathering, right? Now, we are all here today, and so many of us, and at 9 a.m. on Saturday, to affirm that despite the overwhelming visual bias of American history and media history through our textbooks, television documentaries, web pages, and film, we insist on the importance of sound and the powerful and sometimes dominant role of sound in our national life, past and present. We are especially interested in how sound and listening create communities, imagined and otherwise, dominant and subaltern, how they cultivate intimacy and individual, regional, and national identities, and have and can affirm marginalized identities. We seek to remind folks in this visually overloaded age that radio revolutionized the perceptual habits of a nation by bringing orality to the fore. It forever blurred the boundaries between the private, domestic sphere and public, commercial life and political life. It made listening to music a daily requirement for millions of Americans. Even after TV, radio remained a thriving cultural and political force. We are also here to insist that, yes, radio matters, radio history matters, but also history itself matters. With all of the interest in media and communication studies today, in the uses and impact of big data, social media, everything in our digital environment, presentism is getting a pretty big grip on our field, and media history is being minimized. I think we should challenge this, and championing radio history remains an ongoing mission. And we are at an interesting juncture here. Who would have thought 5 years ago that listening to stories, mysteries, politics without images would reemerge as a popular and widespread practice? And then Serial happened in 2014, and it became a word-of-mouth phenomenon across generations. I learned about Serial from 20-somethings. And now we have multiple true crime and murder mystery podcasts, political podcasts like Pod Save America and Love It or Leave It, journalistic podcasts from the New York Times. Even politicians are seeking to host their own podcasts. They are luring people into listening and imagining again. Will these be saved as part of this distinctive national moment? Or will they evaporate into the ether like so many previous sound broadcasts? Everyone here knows how we have had to be and still have to be detectives in locating archives, audio and print, some of them quite motley and incoherent, and to discover what's in them. We're learning at this gathering how many more archives are out there, some still being built and preserved, often by indefatigable people. Many of us in our work have had to piece together what's in everything from like the Paley Center for Media to Chicago's Museum of Broadcast Communications to the Library of American Broadcasting at the University of Maryland to the Pacifica Radio Archives. There are so many more to, of course, the Recorded Sound Research Center here at the Library of Congress, and many more. Many of these, though not all, privilege the networks and a centralized national history. So many recordings from local stations were thrown away. And yet how many might still be moldering in boxes somewhere, probably in someone's garage? Now, to tell our stories, these archives were just the beginning. Radio and sound historians have had to contextualize audio archives within the broader printed historical record, and this is almost always an archive we have to build ourselves. How many of us have, in our offices, basements, attics, garages, our own radio archives, journalistic articles, copies of fan mail, cassettes, interviews, and the like that we have had to put together and we can't bear to part with? These DIY archives help us establish timelines, assess impact and controversies, and helped us see the growing intertextuality among sound, image, and print. These too are part of the radio archives infrastructure. Should part of our preservation task be amalgamating these archives that we each have built? Probably, if we did, it would fill the entire floor of this building. should part of our preservation task also have to do with preserving the oral histories we've collected, the audio interviews we've done. I have at least 2 huge file drawers filled with my archive for listening in, nearly 20 years old now, and I cannot bear to throw it away. Who would take them? Where would they go? So where does radio studies seem to be going? First, of course, is the decentering of the national network story and the golden age of radio, and the exhuming and preserving of local and regional histories. This conference, recent research, and the archives still emerging document the crucial and massively underappreciated role that radio, especially but not solely community and listener-supported radio, played in addressing and giving voice to marginalized groups, including the LGBTQ community as early as the 1970s, Indigenous First Nations communities, Chicano and Latinos, and African Americans. More histories can and need to be written about the connections between such stations, this kind of radio listening, community building, and political activism. Also, we have to remember that in 1971, the FCC issued its primer on ascertainment of community problems by broadcast applicants, what a euphonious title, which gave detailed instructions on how to determine community needs. Stations had to develop an ascertainment procedure that would document the demographics of the station's market, identify what were called significant community groups, and hold meetings with them to discuss community needs and propose programming that would meet those needs. These had to be filed with license renewals. So, what were commercial stations doing in the 1970s before Reagan's FCC rescinded these rules that might also have covered and given voice to underrepresented and marginalized groups? When we find them, and we can use these available clips to teach our students about radio's unsung role here. And this is an important way to link our colleges and universities' commitments to diversity to teaching about previously ignored histories that matter. And I'm stealing a line that Kathy Battles gave me yesterday. These broadcasts, with their community building functions, constitute, and this is a quote from Kathy, the prehistory of social media. And she's totally right. That's maybe how we should teach some of these materials and let our colleagues in ethnic studies, sexuality studies, and other fields know that they're out there. Another possible future is to continue to study listening itself, from radio's multiple modes of address, the phenomenology of listening, to how we engage cognitively and emotionally with what we hear. How do we, ourselves, as researchers, engage with audio archives? We've come a long way in the past 30 years in developing analytical frameworks to conceptualize the role and impact of radio and sound on American culture, politics, the economy, and on racial, class, ethnic, and gender identities. But what would we say our methods are, especially once we're in the audio archives and we're listening? For those of us who are humanities-based scholars, we don't have a tradition like our social science colleagues in laying out in often painstaking detail what our methods are. Yet many of us have tried to construct a kind of semiotics of sound as part of our methods, which don't really exist, aren't terribly codified, and maybe can't be. Now, of course, we focused on the content of radio broadcast, its distinctive language, its mode of description, on the development and use of sound effects, on music as a punctuating force, on radio voices as gendered and raced and the like. In my own work, I sought to develop an archaeology of listening, proposing what types of listening may have emerged or evolved over time, and how mode of address, tone of voice, vocal acrobatics, linguistic slapstick, and the like may have shaped broadcasting practices and listening repertoires. Now, whether what I proposed holds up, I don't know, but sharing with each other how we listen, what we listen for, what we believe different sounds signify, and what we think they're dominant, oppositional, and negotiated readings might be, might help elaborate our collective understandings of the semiotics of sound, especially of radio broadcasting. Another direction for radio studies is, of course, analyzing the phenomenon of the podcast. You can barely keep up with them, and many are followed by young people. What are their different modes of address, their journalistic practices, their presentation of different identities? Now, I have one, you might find odd, observation that distinguishes some of them absolutely from broadcast radio. One thing about the few podcasts I listen to, Love It or Leave It, Pod Save America, occasionally My Favorite Murder. Do you guys know My Favorite Murder? Okay, yeah, okay. Is the way they create intimacy and bond with their audience, in part by relying quite frequently on the F word, particularly as an adjective. These podcasts rely on a combination of humor, political and social commentary, and outrage, and are geared primarily to those in their 20s and 30s, for whom, at least in my experience, the F word is one of the more common and emphatic adjectives, regardless of gender, and it is used to convey anger, disgust, outrage, but also with an edge of irreverence and humor, as in, that is fucking crazy. It almost always has nothing to do with sex and is rather an exclamatory filler affirming defiance. This would be impossible on broadcast radio. And its frequent use works to create an in-club of listeners who don't care about stodgy old forms of decorum, censorship, or politesse. These podcasts are often staged before a live audience, also to create a sense of community. So radio and listening are not dead, and podcasts are bringing this new form of engagement to a younger generation. How they create intimacy is just one of many questions. But their affordances are a bit different. We listen when we want, with others or alone. They are not constrained by broadcast regulation. Knowledge of them spreads primarily by word of mouth, which is always such a mysterious process. How do we grasp this new phenomenon and its generational address? How are gender and race performed on these podcasts? And have they more closely connected the voices of young women to politics, even though Love It or Leave It and Pod Save America are hosted by white men? And as we think about the future of radio studies, one framework can be our wireless imagination. How the imaginary about radio, who the audience is, what radio was and is meant to do, how it connects with politics and a longing still for community, as a through line from wireless's earliest days up to the present. Does radio studies include services like Spotify, Apple Radio, iTunes, and Pandora, and how music listening has changed again with these services, with no DJ to hail us, no ads if you pay enough, songs and playlists selected for you not by a DJ, but by algorithms, the AIing of taste. I think this should be part of radio studies too. Finally, what is so striking about this conference is the enormous energy about and commitment to embracing and sustaining this wireless imagination, its history, and its future. And I look forward to hearing where you think radio studies is going. Thank you. So
I think I'll go over there. I have a few slides, not many. Now, oops, can we bring my PowerPoint up? And here it comes. Yeah. There, okay, good. So I think we're going to have a little discussion between ourselves, because I'm going to start just a little bit by talking about, this is one thing that Alex had actually suggested as the convener of this session, our backgrounds, which are similar but different, and sort of what we bring, originally, many years ago perhaps, Susan and I brought to the field of radio studies, and then how that might affect, our vision, which I think are very similar to where we are and where we might go. But I think the other kind of task of this this session this morning was to say, okay, you know, as Susan has just really admirably described, this field has grown so enormously. It's so great to see. I mean, I can't even imagine a group like this 20 years ago. I mean, it just didn't exist. I mean, look at all the people in this room that have done such fantastic work in radio and sound studies and all the kinds of different things that Susan was saying that our field is expanded into. I'm just going to give a brief plug. I'm pushing for that term sound work. Some of you have heard me expound on this. I've written on it. You know, it's just like, I know, you know, how do you get a new term introduced into the vocabulary? But I think we need a term, sound work, that would encompass radio, and I'm not erasing radio, but that would factor in all these other new forms, and also, you know, things that we don't have a good way of talking about now, like music presentation. You know, music is one thing, but how it's been presented on the radio is a whole separate kind of form in and of itself. So I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, although if you want to ask me about it, I will talk. But anyway, I couldn't resist giving a plug to this group in particular. So when I thought about what to say at the beginning of the second day of this conference in terms of going forward in radio, I thought again, you know, my background is in the humanities. I came to the study of radio through, first of all, cinema studies at NYU way back in the late 70s. But before that, I was a comparative literature major at Indiana University, working with Jim Naramore and a few other people that I think would be known in this group. And just at that moment when I was there, they had started a film studies track in comparative literature, and I took that. And so I was really coming from this background and thinking about texts and thinking about modes of expression and narrative structures and things like that. And although I think, you know, the other great thing, as I think some of you have heard me say, is when cultural studies met with media studies in the 80s, and we began to think much more deeply about issues of power and identity and the cultural significance, the cultural activity of media in our society. You know, that is a formative moment that has shaped, you know, so much of the work that's been done in this room. But also, I like to think about radio studies or sound work as still centrally studying texts. I don't want to turn loose of the idea that radio has produced these wonderful texts, these formal, constructed expressions of meanings of various kinds that need to be analyzed in much the same way that we analyze film, we analyze literature. And I think, as Susan also suggested, we're still in the formative days of that. So I want to go through, I could, of course, you know, and in fact, now that I've retired, what I really love doing, and I do it all the time through kind of interpersonal networks, is recommending all the great work on radio that's come out of the people in this room and others since this field has gotten started, because there are so many people out there in other fields besides ours that are looking to connect with sound work now, because exactly of these new forums that are out there. People in the humanities, people in the social sciences. I get probably one query a week by email from somebody who's saying, you know, I'm really interested in the intersection of theater and radio, and surely someone has written about this. You know, where's the books out there? And I say, you know what? There's some in the 40s, you know, and there's some really great work that touches on that now, but it's a literature waiting to be built. So what I thought I would like to do today is to kind of give a shout out to some of the ways that I think that we as radio studies scholars might work towards reaching out to other fields, and I'm focusing on the humanities myself, but I think it's just as true for the social sciences and for other kinds of academic fields, to get the word out there of this work that we're doing, and also of these incredible archival sources that we are discovering that need to be heard. And as kind of a side note, although this is something I hope we can talk about in the discussion that follows, how we can just communicate amongst ourselves better too about these, you know, when we come together. I've heard about 15 archival collections, at least in the last day and a half, you know, that I just can't wait to explore further. But I wouldn't have known about them unless I had come here to hear people. So how can we, you know, just extend our reach? So I just want to talk about some work that I think that has come out of other fields that is really interesting and suggestive of how our research and our archival efforts can be of use to scholars coming from other areas. And I apologize, I could talk about the work that's just come out of this room, but I'm purposely going outside for the most part to focus on the work by people who are not here today, but would probably really benefit from being. Now let me see, there we go. So for instance, I want to give the example of a student, PhD at Wisconsin from the English department at Wisconsin, whose name is Lisa Hollenbach, who just got her doctorate about 2 years ago. And I wanted to put up, let me just tell you what the title of her dissertation was, Alternative Networks, Recording and Broadcasting American Poetry After 1945. I think the dissertation might be embargoed because I couldn't put my hands on a copy, but I'm sure it's going to come out soon. But she has a really interesting article, if you'd like to read it, that came out in American Literature, Sono Montage, Langston Hughes and Tony Schwartz Listen to Post-War New York. So this is a literature student taking the field of poetry and the poetry of Langston Hughes in particular, putting it together with the sonic work of Tony Schwartz in his Portraits of New York, and looking at the kinds of evocative sounds, the kinds of structures of storytelling that exist in those two very different areas, and making this wonderful connection between the culture of the 1940s and its essential engagement with radio and with recording. Another example, and this one might seem a little abstruse, but let me tell you, it's a really interesting book. It's from a British scholar called Amanda Wrigley, and it's Greece on the Air, Engagements with Ancient Greece on BBC Radio, and this is from the 20s through the 60s. And it's not only about Greek drama. Yes, they put on, the BBC did all kinds of Greek drama on air, but also representations of Greek culture, the way that Greek literature of various kinds kind of entered into not only the programs, but the basic ideas of what drama was and how poetry engaged with radio. Again, a humanities scholar who came to radio and really had to learn it from scratch and is doing this kind of interesting work. I think there's lots of our colleagues out in literature departments and other kinds of arts departments who would be really, who need to hear from us and need to know what we've been doing. Here's another example, slightly different. Simon Potter, this is again a Brit. He's at the University of Bristol. And it got into, from a background in modern history, this book, Broadcasting Empire, the BBC and the British World. Again, he was a person who said, I'm interested in empire and the structures of empire and how the British Empire was built and established. Radio was imperative. How do I find out more about radio? Where are the resources? And he went on from there to, I just put together a group that he's running now. It's a Leverhulme Trust-supported research network, Connecting the Wireless World, Writing Global Radio History, with a consortium of scholars from a lot of different countries. So again, this kind of effort to reach out and to broaden the relevance of our field and to support the humanities at a time when humanities is being questioned and in some cases undermined, by pointing to this vital field of endeavor that we're all engaged in, I think is a really important task for us. So that's one thing, reaching outwards to other fields and demonstrating the relevance of our research. The other thing, again, touched on before by Susan, and by me, I've been sort of harping on this for a little while. Maybe some of you have read my Lost Critical History of Radio essay, where I'm talking about where is that critical vocabulary that has been built up in the other arts? How do we talk about radio texts as narratives in terms of the expressive elements that are available to us, in terms of their relationship to other kinds of genres and modes of expression? And I hope that most of you are familiar by now, and if you aren't, I hope you will become familiar with the really great work that Siobhan McHugh is doing out of the University of Monash, Australia, with Radio Doc Review. And that's small, and I don't know if that title, maybe you can see it, Radio Doc Review. I've just put up the contents of the latest issue. And so for the last, I think, 2 years, this is an online journal only. She's working with creators of podcasts, of radio programs, of different kinds of audio work, and having them review other people's work, and also reaching out to scholars to do reviews, serious, in-depth, critical reviews. I don't know if Jason is here today, but he has a review, as you might see up there, Jason Lovilio, of Criminal, I did a podcast that some of you might know. And I also have to point out that, yes, Neil Verma, I think, Neil, you may be the, I had to make an exception on Neil's behalf. He's probably the only person in the audience whose work I'm mentioning, even though you all deserve mention, because he has a really fascinating two-part essay here, The Arts of Amnesia, the Case for Audio Drama, where he really does this job that I've just been waiting for somebody to do, to connect the kind of aesthetics and central questions and modes of radio from the earlier period and podcasting today. And it's a really fascinating essay. But you know, Neil, I'm really becoming worried about you because you've listened to more radio drama, as far as I can tell, just quantifiably, than any other person I know. And like, when do you do this? You know, I know you have you have a demanding job, you have a family. You know, I'm beginning to think, do you not sleep? You know, so okay, good. I'm glad to know that. But yeah, what is that? Oh, so he's just constantly getting through the fillings in his teeth. Oh, you know, that is brilliant. I got to figure out how to do this. That's all I can say. But it's really interesting critical work, and I think Siobhan, like on a shoestring and getting very little credit from her university because she has been involved herself as a radio producer, has, I think, I don't know how many, well, it probably tells me, doesn't it, what issue we're up to? Volume 3, Issue 1, I think it's 4 a year. It's a really incredible resource. I want to then also say that I've been really encouraged to see other things, other kinds of venues for people who are doing a kind of the humanistic assessment of and building up of a critical vocabulary and repertoire. And I hate to mention the word canon because I think that it has such a negative implication, but to talk about like what is really great radio work that we should be remembering. And I think all of us have our personal little canon that we have in our head. But it's things like awards and prizes and recognition that sort of build this up more publicly. And of course, the Peabody's been doing that for a long time. And I've been on one of the Peabody pre-screening committees for a couple of years ago, along with some people in this audience. And they're great, but they don't, it's a policy of the Peabody's not to talk about the criteria, the methods, or anything, never to actually set criteria except excellence. Okay, but, could we talk about it a little more? And I think that this is an award called the Sarahs, which comes from Sarah Lawrence College, and maybe some of you know about it, where every year they have, they give out a couple of radio awards, bring people in. And I have to, and they also have a website on which they publish articles about the radio dramas and other documentaries that they give awards to. And I want to point you in particular, the one I found really fascinating, because she was doing exactly what I was saying somebody needed to do in the Lost Art of Radio, sorry. I've forgotten the title of my own article now, but could you please fill that in? The Lost Critical History of Radio. And it's called Towards a Poetics of Audio, The Importance of Criticism. And she's a producer, not a scholar, and it's a really interesting article to read. I'd recommend it. And then finally, and I'm probably wrapping up fast, which I think is good because one thing that we did want to do here was, get a more dialogue going amongst ourselves this morning since we had a little time to do it. How many of you know about Radio Atlas? You know how, the old saw, there are no subtitles in radio, right? Which makes it hard for us to listen out, to use a phrase from Kate Lacey, a British radio scholar, because the radio is in different languages, and unless we are really familiar with the languages that it's in, it's very hard to listen to French radio, to German radio, to Assyrian radio. We just cannot do that. This is a effort of love run by Eleanor McDowell, and she's a producer of radio too, working with Falling Tree Productions, Alan Hall, really well-known group of producers, that subtitles radio. You go online, and there's wonderful radio dramas from around the world, and you can listen to them in the original with subtitles running so that you have a translation of what is being said. And it's, she's doing it on a shoestring. She actually emailed me one time and said, I don't know if you know who I am, but I have this Radio Atlas site, you might find it interesting. And I said, oh, I've written about it. And so it's an effort to kind of reach across national boundaries and linguistic differences, and I think a really promising thing for sound work, and I'm using the term radio, but I'll go back to sound work, and its future and its impact in the larger intellectual and cultural universe. So thank you.
thank you both, Michelle and Susan. I think there's, from our, we had a brief conversation, and I think yesterday about this, and what I think really came out of it were both the ways in which I think we share, or both of these talks share, right? Both a sort of focus on the simultaneously, right, looking to the importance of the past and the history, but also recognizing the tremendous moment we are in right now, right? The renaissance of sound and its sort of centrality within our larger culture. So that's one sort of way of sort of looking back and looking forward, but also the insistence on both disciplinary specificity, right, in certain ways of talking about audio and sound as sound, right, but also the inherently multidisciplinary way, right, in which we need to look at various kind of contexts as radio cuts across aesthetics and technology and identity and economics, right? And so I think this sort of provides a really important way for us to begin to, have this conversation about where we will go forward in radio studies. And so with that, I wanted just to open it up for questions that you guys had, or if you guys wanted to respond to one another, we could also do that.
Oh, that's.
Oh, here's someone. I'm not sure he's qualified to ask a question here in this room. Bill Siemering.
I don't want to add to there's so many things that have been opened up here, but I've been working in radio and developing countries, and there are studies on impact. This is where you still have radio as a primary source for over 80% of the people, and it's transformative. We know the story of Rwanda historically, but now I've done case studies of a radio station there that has sponsored 40 live debates in the last year.
Wow.
And your radio listening clubs and the engagement of the community with the radio stations is quite amazing. I just want to add one little footnote from yesterday. I had mentioned this is radio.
Damn it.
And that's really the origins of Fresh Air with Terry Gross. So I just want to be on the record for that. A couple of other points, just 30 seconds. But a couple of the things that were in the very early days of radio, the University of the Air, the College of the Air, the lectures, really is in a new form to project radio on the public.
Yes.
And the chapter A of reading books, which Carl Schmidt did right up almost till he died, is audible. So
how true.
Some of those themes are continuing on.
I don't know, could people hear that at all? Okay, so just to summarize, first of all, it was, oh geez, I'm going to work backwards and then you'll help me. Some things like Chapter a Day, really a precursor to audio, which was on, starting from the 20s, wasn't it? And also University of the Air, yes, like TED Talks, so kind of interesting parallels in it, some that we could, that we could draw on today. And you also said, you just wanted to say that this is radio, damn it, as you said yesterday, that was really the precursor to Terry Gross's, or was Terry Gross's program. And I'm sorry, you were making a point about developmental radio too, about how many debates?
Yeah, in Rwanda.
In Rwanda.
40 live debates.
40 live debates, yeah.
In a year.
Transformative.
Donna Halper, Leslie University.
Donna.
If you guys have already addressed this, my apologies if you guys have already addressed this, but could we say a couple of words about college radio? And the reason I wanted to say something about that is I see an incredible negativity that really scares me at a lot of college campuses. It used to be that those of us who are broadcasters, whether we're doing podcasts today or streaming audio or blah, 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 we all got our start in college radio. And in university after university, I'm seeing people say, well, oh, kids today, they don't care about radio, so we're getting rid of our station, we're selling off our assets. And that makes me incredibly nervous because A, it's our history, but B, radio has always done a horrible job of telling our story. okay? And I say that, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. I'm, just one of many media historians are sitting in this room, and I am one of them. But it really breaks my heart to see years and years of history just dismissed like, oh, kids today don't care about that anymore. And when I look at my students and I ask them whether they use radio, they generally say they do not. And when I was a kid growing up, I couldn't imagine anything better than being a DJ, than being on the air. And I said on someone's podcast last year, I said, kids today don't have radio dreams. So to some degree, I feel like we are trying to preserve something, but we're also trying to sell something. Does that make any sense? Not sell it like money-wise, but sell our story. Let people know that we still matter, that we're still here, and we're still important.
Do you guys want to respond to that?
Well, I don't have too much to say about that. When I went to graduate school at Brown, there was a student-run station there that was a commercial station, and had a lot of students involved in it, including myself. Enormous impact. I think it's still going strong, but it was primarily, they did news. And of course, a lot of music. I don't know what they're doing now at Michigan. We don't have an official college-run radio station in the same way. We have an NPR station. So you might want to talk about this a bit.
Yeah, they did.
Did they?
Yeah.
And their assets were sold to a Christian broadcaster.
Oh.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but they're.
Yeah. Oh, that's sad. I mean, it was a great station. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually Nate DeMeo, who also has a wonderful historical podcast, wrote a great, amazing elegy for WBRU that just was published like a couple weeks ago. But like on one hand, yes, Donna, I agree that maybe students don't have radio dreams, but I do think they have sound dreams. Right, and one of the things that we can debate the essential importance of liveness within radio, right? Because that is something that is lost with podcasting, right? But the fact that BRU is able to continue online, right, also sort of suggests the resilience, right, of the ways in which people are embracing and using sound to say something about their lives, form these different kind of communities, and express themselves in various ways. So, are there other folks?
Respond directly to that. I want to put in a plug for a website and podcast, Radio Survivor. I know Jennifer Waits is here. I don't know if other folks are, but about a year ago, they did an episode, maybe two. Excuse me, conference voice. On how colleges and universities can save their stations and how they can start making the case before the commercial broadcaster, the Christian broadcaster, comes in and wants to take over, buy their facilities. Because it's easy for university presidents to see this as a pot of money, a gold mine that they're sitting on. And so how to already begin now making the case and like annual reports and different things the colleges and universities can do proactively and preemptively to save whatever college stations they might still have. So talk to Jennifer Waits or just look up Radio Survivor. And it's about a year ago, maybe Jennifer knows more, but I just wanted to throw that in there. It is something that we, as those of us on college campuses, can be doing right now to save radio.
And I would just add, just to take Alex's phrase, they're having sound work dreams, students. I mean, can we tie, the popularity of sound in general to the radio stations? That's a really good strategy.
But behind Bill, maybe that would help for the microphone.
I'd like to respond to that as well. The work I'm doing is at Indiana State University. The person I am researching built WISU. It's been in business for over 50 years. That station started going downhill, same problem, but in the 90s. There is a young man who took a program management position 4 years ago at that station. His name is Rich Green, and he is rebuilding that radio program, and his students are excited about it. So there is hope. It's not all doom and gloom.
I don't know, Josh, you have the mic, so that probably gives you a certain amount of power.
Okay, thank you. By La Baptiste Miles College, will you comment on ideas that terrestrial radio is on a decline and on the rise is streaming, satellite, and other digital platforms?
I would just say at least we haven't shut down all of our FM stations here like they did. Was it in Norway? Just this, but you're right. I'm, not to minimize it. I think because that brought out all these issues of, well, what does terrestrial broadcasting give us that streaming can't possibly? And of course, it was immediately. I mean, you can see the significance for emergency broadcasting, and also for all it would take is for a few servers to go out for the streaming services to get interrupted, and I'm sure we've all experienced this. And also that for certain kinds of applications like radio and automobiles, I mean, it's vital to have broadcast radio. I keep thinking, and I'm no expert on this, so I'm just sort of wishfully hoping that, there are ways to tie those together so that they remain vital. But I don't know. I mean, do you think we're in danger of terrestrial radio being phased out here in the United States?
I think that's an aspect of the way radio is overlooked.
Here comes the mic. Here comes the man with the mic.
We'd have to look up the details, but you have to turn it on. I can't quote the statistics accurately right off the top of my head, but I think the idea that terrestrial radio is in decline is part of the way radio gets overlooked, as some of the points Susan Douglas was starting out with. 90-some% of Americans listen to radio at least once a week, and most of them listen to it every morning. But it's built into our daily routine. We overlook it. We experience it as routine, not as special.
I think part of this is, and I'm revealing my own generational identification here, but with so much emphasis on millennials, what are they doing? How are they driving all kinds of marketing? That can drive also this overlooking of radio. And, when I mentioned podcasts, because that's what a lot of them are listening to. And one of the reasons that some of them have, at least in their late teenage and sort of early to mid 20 years, abandoned radio, is because commercial radio ruined itself. Right? I mean, Clear Channel ruined itself, So, yeah, it destroyed itself, with these. Yeah, I mean, the music formats are a nightmare, and so we actually have in Ann Arbor 107.1, which is, I think it's a Sirius station now. No, not Sirius. What's the other one? Not Clear Channel. Huh? I can't.
Cumulus?
Sorry?
Cumulus?
No, it might be a Cumulus station, yeah. And so we have this DJ who's like the morning DJ, and a lot of stuff comes down from corporate, that he's sort of stuck with. But on Sunday, he has his own show. And he's an actual DJ, and he knows everything about producers. And they fired him a couple of years ago. They fired him. The community went crazy. People were outraged. And one of the main advertisers, a bank in town, said they were going to yank all of their advertising unless they put that guy back on the air. And he is an example of how radio can still thrive and really speak to an audience that is an utter counter-distinction to the clear channeling of radio. No wonder young people don't listen to the radio, But I'm finding that some of them, I have quite a few 20-something friends, in part because of my daughter. They get out of college and they're driving to work, or they start listening to NPR.
It's true.
You know, and so and they're listening to podcasts because they're getting something they think is genuine. They're not getting commercials, and they're not getting Clear Channel.
Okay, it was on. Jennifer Waits from Radio Survivor. I haven't heard anybody talk about low power FM at the conference, and for me, having visited a bunch of brand new low power FM stations, I feel like this is an unprecedented point in radio history in our lifetimes, where we're getting to see so many brand new radio stations at the same time. So I see a lot of energy in terrestrial radio around low power FMs, and maybe because they're hyper local, it hasn't become as much of a national story, and maybe because they're so new, it hasn't become an academic story yet. But within the community radio community, this is a huge, incredible period of time, and I'm seeing young people engaged with these new stations, and it's just a really interesting energy. And I would also agree that I think young people often don't realize that they're actually listening to radio when they're in the car and there's a radio on. And it's like this ambient. So people say, no, I never listen to radio, but they probably are actually listening to radio every day. So,
you know, I do wonder, we're at, you know, with the Twittering of America, and the often, how negative a space Twitter can be and has become, and also some other aspects of social media have become nasty places. Whether things like low power FM are going to be kind of the antidote or the anti-Twitter move to community building, because you do have some community building on Twitter, but you also have community annihilation on Twitter too. So I'd actually love to hear more about what where around the country you've found all of this.
And
yeah.
Just to piggyback on that really briefly, I mean, I'm sure you know this, Jennifer, but you know, it's editing the journal. We just did a special issue on community media, and it is amazing. I mean, Bill knows this. In Africa, community radio is, you know, in South America, in Europe. I mean, there's so much enthusiasm and excitement, and new stations coming on all the time. And I just, you know. We got very few submissions to that issue from people in the United States, and maybe the excitement level is, we need, you know, it's not quite there, but I wish it could be.
Just quickly, the University of Michigan has a student-run station, WCBN.
CBN.
And it's been on the air for 50 years. Its claim to fame was for playing It's My Party and I'll Cry If I Want To when Ronald Reagan was elected for 24 hours in a row. It was the 24 hours. But as part of Michigan's bicentennial celebrations, the paper archives of the radio station were collected and deposited in the Bentley Historical Library. And a lot of WCBN, they've moved to connecting the dots between college radio and podcasting. They've moved much of their work to podcast. They have a podcast server. If you can look it up as WCBN podcast, and so what goes over the radio then becomes podcast, and they think of production in mentally as podcasting first, that happens to be broadcast first and then archived on a podcast server. So it's alive and living, and I think that this is a situation with a lot of college radio. But anyway, I just wanted to. I didn't.
Do they have official? Yeah, I know about BCN, but do they have official, you know, university support and a?
Yes, they do. It's based out of it's funded by Literature, Science, and the Arts.
LS&A funds.
Yes,
yeah.
and the radio station is in the basement of the LS&A building. So yeah. Anyway.
I just wanted to add a little bit to the whole concept of you know, digitization and radio is dying. In America, we're actually pretty lucky in that we have a shitty digital radio system called HD radio. It is spectrally intensive. It does not provide a qualitative improvement over analog broadcasting, and it's wholly proprietary, meaning that you actually have to pay a private company a licensing fee to adopt the radio technology. Fortunately, the FCC back in the early 2000s made the adoption of the digital radio standard wholly voluntary and driven by the marketplace. And the marketplace has pretty much rejected HD radio. Less than 15% of all licensed broadcasters have actually adopted the technology, and the platform itself has been sold from its parent company, and it's now part of a larger intellectual property conglomerate that doesn't really care that much about radio broadcasting. So HD radio and the digital transition of radio in the United States is something that can be actively resisted on many fronts. And I'd also kind of like to make a plea for the analog. Since digital radio transition in the United States is not working very well, there is something to be said for reclaiming analog spectrum for community use. Analog radio is not trackable. It's not part of the Panopticon like social media is. And for people that are very involved in activism, that's a very useful tactical tool. And the FCC does not have the authority, nor has it really had the full authority to actually enforce the broadcast license requirement. So yesterday I was talking in one of the panels about the fact that in the place where I live, New York City, there are more unlicensed FM radio stations on the air right now than there are licensed FM radio stations. So those of you who are interested in media activism and social movements, I would strongly suggest that you look at radio as a mechanism for tactical organization and communication. And it's a fairly simple risk assessment to do. And it actually, in my view, has been a key component to the revitalization of radio as a community building exercise. And I think that's going to continue for the foreseeable future.
Somebody had her hand up for a long time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Jenny Doctor. I've done a lot of work on both British radio and also American radio. And I agree with a lot of what's been said. In teaching American students about radio, it's very interesting when they hear the word radio, they're immediately turned off. And I find that when I start introducing them to some of what's happening around the world in actually broadcast radio, and I start actually showing them that you can access that and you can hear the creative space that radio is and all that's going on and the really lively discussions and some of what's actually starting to happen as we're talking about, not in what they think of radio, which is Clear Channel or whatever it's called these days, but actually at radio as creative space, then all of a sudden they are excited and they love it, and that's what they think of as podcasts. So I think part of this is a language issue. They want to be involved with that creative space. They don't want to be involved with what they think of as old-fashioned radio. So I do think part of it, I love the sound work concept because I do think we have a language issue. I love radio. I'm from that generation, but I know that when I'm trying to get through to my students and get them to take my courses, I have to include Spotify. I have to include all these. I have to say I'm talking about an expanded definition of what radio is. Don't think of it as what you think it is. Let's talk about what it is today. And then if I bring them along with me, then all of a sudden they want to be a part of it and they want to help. They want to create within it. So I think if we're going to go in the future, I do think we have to think of the semantics of it, but I also think we have to think of it as creative. That's what they want. They want it to be a space that's creative.
And that gets,
yeah. I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions.
I just had just one comment. The unique strength of broadcast radio is it's not just bringing information to people vertically, it's the horizontal conversations that is unique to live broadcast.
Yeah.
Garrett Horton from Concordia University, Portland, Oregon. In connection with what has just been said, I was wondering if anybody in the room can point to studies that have connected these developments to mediatization as a theoretical concept, because I've dabbled a little bit in the notion of mediatization, the idea that our world is becoming ever more saturated and defined by media, and mediatization scholars want to point out that there's all these various new developments, and mediatization is a development like globalization, like many others. And it might also help us to maybe update and bring sort of this discussion into a a broader context that tries to define the influence of media in the current world, and mediatization might just be a way to do that.
I guess, thinking about this from a teaching point of view, what so many of us are grappling with now and seeking to revise our courses around is this very phenomenon and the ways in which our students are so constantly bombarded by and engaged in with screens all the time, that it's actually difficult for them to stand back and see how much they are in a mediatized world, or whatever the correct way to describe it is. And so I'm in the process of revising our big introductory course now, and I have to start with all of the different ways in which they are engaged with and bombarded by screens that is very different from, when 20 years ago, and work back from that to get them to then stand back and really see the ocean that they're swimming in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's it. We have to. Oh, we're getting the.
We're getting the hook.
Thank you all.
Great. Thank you to this session. This is an ideal, significant, and very rare session to have in general. Increasingly rare and significant because we are trying to make a concerted effort to focus on Spanish language radio or broadcasting in Spanish or multilingually within the geographical boundaries of the United States. We are definitely in solidarity with all these other significant and important panels taking place right now at the same time, the African American radio panel as well as the podcasting digital panel. Despite startling growth and the increasing use of Spanish, there's still very little scholarly attention, mainstream or popularity attention that's given to this medium. Today, I'm very happy to be a part of this panel with these amazing panelists. I am Dolores Inés Casillas. I'm at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I write on Spanish language radio broadcasting. I've been doing that for the past 10 years. We also have Mari Castaneda, who's chair of communications at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. There is one book, the first book that was written on Spanish language radio was published in 1978. The second book was mine in 2014. But between those two publications, Mari Castaneda published a piece in 2003 in the Journal of Radio Audio Studies that really revitalized this field of study for Spanish language radio. It's considered a canonical piece in the field. We also have Amalia Cordova, who's a Latino digital curator with Smithsonian Folklife at Washington, D.C., who's going to be talking a lot about in Spanish indigenous bilingual broadcasting in the U.S., and Hugo Morales, who we heard yesterday at our Public Media 50th Anniversary panel, who did not receive the kind of introduction that I felt that he definitely merited given his decades of work constructing Radio Bilingüe, which is the largest bilingual Latino public radio network in the country, known to some as a Spanish-speaking NPR of the United States. We also have Rosa Ramon, who's a co-founder of KDNA FM in Washington. She is known as one of the pioneering women in the Pacific Northwest who encouraged Chicanas to be radio producers and radio hosts, and in turn, that changed the programming we listen to and the culture at a lot of radio stations. Mónica de la Torre, who's an assistant professor of transborder studies at Arizona State University, has dedicated actually her studies to KDNA FM in Washington and has constructed a phenomenal online archive of that radio station. We also have Magali Rivera, who's executive director of the Latino Public Radio Consortium. And right now, and speaking from the previous plenary, we're speaking a little bit about analog and community activism, and the Latino Public Radio Consortium is key right now in trying to keep radio stations on the air in Puerto Rico. She's key in trying to rebuild radio stations there, and as a reminder, even though Hurricane Maria hit over a month ago, there's still only 80% of the island has electricity but the radio station that ran in analog was the one that was broadcasting. And lastly, we have Joy Hayes, who's the Associate Professor of Communications at the University of Iowa. Also wrote a phenomenal book called Mexico Nation, which was the first book in English to really document the significance of broadcasting in Mexico as it built its nation. And she will be our discussant today. It really is a star-studded kind of panel, and it probably would have been like the kind of panel I would have envisioned as a dream panel 10 years ago. Before we begin, I do want to remind people that Spanish-dominant Latinos listen the most to radio, and this is a demographic that we actually don't pay a lot of attention to, much more so than English-dominant listeners or African-American listeners. In fact, a listener profile, I like to remind people that the average Spanish-language radio listener earns $35,000 a year. And I feel like I need to remind an NPR crowd of that. And as someone who definitely struts around in my NPR t-shirt as well, is very cognizant of the very different demographic of listeners. Listeners tune in 3 hours, Latino listeners tune in 3 hours longer a week than the general, which is code for white English language radio listener. They listen much earlier. They tune in usually at 4 a.m. in the morning rather than 5:30 or 6 a.m. when we hear early morning hosts. And in my research and elsewhere, I've written about how the majority of Latino listeners take their radio sets to work with them. And we know this when we pass a construction site. We know this when we use a bathroom at the back of a restaurant. I knew this morning when the radio was coming out of my hotel housekeeper's cart when she was walking down the hall. It is a part of our everyday landscape in the United States, whether we recognize it or not. And given the fact that it is a working class medium, I really try and advocate that it's also a very kind of brown collar way of listening. It's not something that we listen in the solitary confinements of our car when we commute. And it's definitely something that's much more a public form of listening because of immigrants. So with that, we're going to get started with Mari Casaneda.
Thank you, Ines, for that wonderful introduction of the panel and all of us here today. Thank you all for making time. I want to just thank the organizers for this gathering, especially Josh, who invited way back in the day to really start thinking about this issue. A few years ago, I was helping out with sort of the archiving that was happening in New England, and particularly Western Massachusetts. I'm only going to speak for a few minutes because I really do want to recognize our panelists and the limited time that we have here today. And this in itself could be its own conference of gathering of folks. There's many more of us that are starting to really examine these issues and really think about the archiving. I just wanted to highlight this particular sort of website. Is a piece that I wrote called New England Latinidades Through Spanish Language Radio, the case of WFCR's Tertulia. And WFCR is actually an NPR affiliate in Western Mass that's located in the 5 colleges, which includes UMass Amherst, Smith College, Hampshire, Mount Holyoke, and Hampshire College, and Amherst College as well. And one of the things that's really important about this particular program, it's that it's the only Spanish language program that started late 70s, early 80s, that is still continuously broadcast as a show in Western Massachusetts. And given what's happened with Maria in Puerto Rico, and we have a very large concentration of Boricuas in the Western Massachusetts area, this particular program has increasingly become very important more recently in terms of sharing information of what's going on in the area, and also the relocation that's happening of a lot of folks coming back from the island. So in terms of its presence, it's still a very important program. But one of the things that happened as we started examining archives across Western Mass and across New England was that the question of, what archives are worthy of preservation and how are they preserved? And Tertulia, the original producer who is here is Luis Alfonso Melendez, who now actually lives in Puerto Rico and was central in the creation of Radio Vieques as well. And so now there's a new producer that's in charge of Tertulia. But one of the things that we started talking about was the fact that he had all these archives of cassette tapes of the program that he had done, because the station itself was not necessarily recording or preserving the programs that were happening at the time. And so he, as the radio producer, took on upon himself to try to record as much as possible some of the cassette tapes, some of the programs that were happening through cassettes. And so he has these boxes and boxes and boxes of programs that actually included conversations, for instance, about freeing Oscar Lopez, that he was recently freed over the summer, and the importance of those conversations and mobilization that was happening even back in the 90s. But one of the challenges that we found was that even though universities, including UMass, were interested in the archive, one of the things that they made very clear was like, you can't just give us a box and then we're going to put it away in a sort of room and that's it. That the archival work really does require someone has to go in and really listen to the program, take notes, really examine what's going on with it, what are the various different sort of themes and topics and the conditions of the cassettes and the various different pieces of the programming that were recorded. And so it's been a big challenge because of the limited resources that some of the libraries have, the limited, the fact that there's very limited folks in that region that speak fluently in Spanish in terms of being able to really transcribe what is happening with regards to those programs. And so one of the things that I've been trying to do is work with some of my students that are fluent Spanish speakers as part of a course, community engagement course, to try to really document that particular archive to make sure that the conversations that really have shaped a lot of New England, and particularly Western New England, Latinidades, and conversations about the fact that there's a large Puerto Rican community that's been there since the 40s, and increasingly also Salvadoreño, Guatemalteco, Mexicano from Oaxaca, that are relocating to the region because of agriculture, and particularly the tobacco fields, that again, tertulia has been historically very important. Here we go. Has been historically been very important in helping sort of think about the community itself. And so I just wanted to put it up there. So I just want to just note this because there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And I think the question of, again, whose archives are worth preserving and how are they preserved and what kind of resources are being put in there became very clear in the process of both looking at Tertulia and various different archives in Western Mass that are specifically serving communities of color that have been ignored, that have not been taken into account, that don't have the resources to be able to really sort of preserve them in the way that they deserve to be preserved. And in fact, one of the things that came up in the course of trying to think about what was happening with this particular archive and others is that we were literally oftentimes confronted with folks just saying, is this really that important? Is it worth the resources to pour into this particular type of archive? It's gonna cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, perhaps, definitely lots of hours of labor, and is it something that is worth preserving? And of course, our argument was yes, absolutely. A lot of the programming that was happening, particularly in Tertulia, is really documenting the history of Latinos in Western Massachusetts and in the New England area, because they were not just focusing on Western Mass, but also about the migration of folks to the Northeast. And so really had both regional, national, and transnational conversations, because sometimes Luis was also actually phoning in with folks in Puerto Rico and Mexico and different parts of Latin America about what was happening in those areas and how that was impacting U.S. Latinos as well, because of course the connections that were happening between communities are not as sort of separate as oftentimes people assume them to be. And so really trying to think about, again, whose archives are we really emphasizing? I'm struck that oftentimes we're not really thinking about communities of color and the archives that do exist, but what kind of resources do we have to make those available to other people because of the rich cultural history that actually does exist in these programs. And so this is one of the projects that I'm working on, trying to really document that. But there's a lot of work to do and a lot of other projects, and I know that a lot of my friends and colleagues here are engaged with that. But I really want us to think a little bit more deeply about how do we actually make that effort to really include those archives in these conversations. For instance, this program should be part of the Library of Congress, should be documented and preserved, and why is it not happening? How do we make that happen is the thing I want to conclude with. Thank you.
Hugo, you next? Put your side.
No, Amalia.
Oh, Amalia.
Mari pu lamian pu kompucheninche Amalia. Buenos dias, good morning. I like starting multilingually because my life is that way. And I want to thank the conference for putting us together. I also want to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Piscataway Nation on whose land we're gathered today. I wanted to talk about other languages in the ambiente. And I thought I would start with an event that happened as a side event of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which is held every year. And in 2015, in the spring, a student of NYU, of Quechua language program, organized the Transnational Voices panel of indigenous radio broadcasters. 3 of them were broadcasting in the New York City area. One of them, Rosa Palomino, was visiting. She's a very famous, well-known Aymara broadcaster. So it was an occasion to actually have a conversation around the different languages that are spoken in the Northeast again, and specifically in New York City, which happens to be the city with the largest indigenous population of all the United States, if you combine indigenous people from all over the world, not just the continental United States. So Tiokasan Ghost Horse, who runs First Voices Indigenous Radio, which is the stable indigenous North American radio show in New York City on Pacifica Network, gave the introductory remarks, working with Mario Murillo, who used to work with WBAI, which is another Pacifica affiliate and the morning program. And Segundan Camarca, who's Quechua, and who is a radio broadcaster who was working on Spanish language radio, but then he met Charlie, and he met other people who were working in Quechua, and they decided to put together a Quechua language radio show in New York, a weekly online broadcast program. And the 2 other broadcasters are Leobardo Atjalam, who's Quiche Maya, and Jose Suarez Totonaco from Mexico. So how does Quechua start to scan across New York City? There's a Quechua program funded by Title VI funding of the Department of Education under the Foreign Language and Area Studies funding. And so the students of the Quechua program are learning Quechua as part of their foundational academic training, but they know there's a community out there, and so increasingly the program is not just about having language lessons on the campus, but getting language speakers from across the tri-state area to come in and hear different variants and really think of Quechua as a living language and as a language that's around you, not somewhere in a remote place. So there are weekly workshops open to the community. There are podcasts being created by the students so they can listen and hear and practice their Quechua, and there are community gatherings. So we already had this kind of soundscape happening around us at NYU, and I was, at that time, the assistant director of the Center for Latin American Studies at NYU. And so these 3 Quechua speakers, because Charlie Uruchima is a second-generation Ecuadorian, and his parents were not really invested in him learning Quechua. That was seen as something to leave behind. And when he said, I want to study Quechua, and I'm going to learn Quechua at NYU, he was like, why are you using your credits this way, right? So it's a whole sort of work to legitimize the language again, as again, a contemporary language and a language that's around us. So the radio show was a wonderful way for them to get together. Fabián Buenala, Segundo Camarca, and Charlie Uruchima got together. And Segundo, who had already this wonderful radio experience, built the studio that you see now in a basement of a building in the Bronx. And this is how Quechua Hatari begins, by just doing it and bringing the community together. And they broadcast in Spanish and Quechua, sometimes in Quechua, and sometimes in English, depending on who their guests are. So as a programmer of the Folk Life Festival last year, we really wanted to bring these kind of initiatives and this kind of work to the mall. So we built a little station called, during our program called On the Move. We were talking about migration in the United States as part of our 50th anniversary. We had a media production set up really, really bare bones. I don't know if you've been to the festival, but we have to build it on the mall and then take it down. So there are no hard walls. It's all just tarp and 2x4s. So we built this media studio on the mall, and we invited Quechua Hatari to be our resident media collective. So they basically, when we were planning this, I was thinking, how are you going to do this? And when they told me the activities they were thinking, I was like, you're basically bringing the studio onto the mall, right? So that's what they did. So this was them intervening this blackboard that we put. They brought the huipala, the flag. And of course, we also had other programs with the local Andean community, which is huge here around the DC, Virginia area. So thinking about the people I was bringing, I was very excited to think that there would be all these cross references. So Quichua Hatari ends up interviewing the caporal team, or the dance troupe that we brought of different Bolivian caporal dancers, and in Quichua and Quechua, right, depending on who they were bringing, mostly Quechua, interviewing local DJ who's Bolivian, whose grandfather spoke Quechua, and just producing these new relationships. And they liked this idea of the pop-up so much. Like, we called it the mixing room. That's what this little space that you see behind. We called that the mixing room. And it was an open air studio. And they liked this idea so much that they're now doing this in other festivals and events. This was kind of the first time they took the studio out. So they have a page on the Smithsonian Folklife website. You can go visit it and learn a little bit more about their work. Another thing they did was offer Quechua class. In the bottom row in the middle, you see Fabian Muenala doing an open-air Quechua class for the public. And we were able to get this out, and people came. They actually got an audience. We were having interviews of the participants come through this open-air studio. We had students come through, and at the end of the day, they would just get together and do some music right there on the mall after hours. So they really took over the space, and this is just a way to show how you can bring the liveness of radio out into the air and consider it in your programming, that it's not just something that has to stay in a digital medium. You can show people the value of this engagement, and they really did a great job by bringing things like the huipala, the Andean flag, things like bringing the Quechua class methodology, by bringing the music, by DJing on site. So they really spilled over their kind of usual format of 2-hour broadcast on Friday. And this is something that really was easy to incorporate into our thinking around a live presentation on the mall, open air public presentation. So they broadcast Radio El Tambo Stereo every Friday, 6 to 8. The episodes are archived on the Quichua Hatari website. It's in Spanish and in Quichua. Little pieces are in English too. They have a Facebook page where they're regularly posting the events that they're starting to travel in different places. So they've been to Havana, to the Casa de Americas, to a conference there on radio. They're really getting attention, and they have a Twitter handle, Quichua Hatari. So I just wanted to bring up the importance of thinking outside of just Spanish language. Spanish is a bridge to other constituencies. And I think what Quichua Hatari and other collectives are doing is creating this diaspora, bringing together this diaspora of people who, because of the jobs and the migration and sometimes documentation status and just geographic remoteness, don't come together. And through the radio, they're bringing together this language community, which ends up being a cultural community. So that's how important this is. And also, people are using the radio program as an entry point into language revitalization. So by listening and hearing Quichua and Quechua bilingually, broadcast bilingually, people have started to also realize that they understand or be interested and say, I want to speak better, I want to gain fluency, right? So this is part of the project. Their website really explains their mission well. They talk about Andean worldview, they talk about the language, but they also talk about the living community. And I'll be happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Inés, ¿cómo le muevo? ¿Cómo le avanzo? Oh, okay. Buenos días. Good morning. So Hugo Morales. I'm Hugo Morales, and I want to tell you a little bit about the history of Radio Bilingüe, and then proceed to give you a little bit of an idea about what it is already archived here at the Library of Congress of Radio Bilingüe. So I'm Hugo Morales. I'm a co-founder of Radio Bilingüe. Thank you, Inés, for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to Rosa Ramon's story. She's been a real force in public broadcast, particularly community radio. So, Radio Bilingüe was founded in 1976, and we went on the air on July 4th, 1980. And we chose July 4th, 1980 because we wanted to affirm the fact that we're U.S. citizens, the fact that we, too, should have a space in the airwaves of this country, and we wanted to be recognized. We also wanted to express and exercise our First Amendment rights. That's why we funded Radio Bilingüe, and we chose July 4th. It's really important to note that date, at least for me, a co-founder, that when we founded Radio Bilingüe, there were about 15 million Latinos in the U.S., which is about, say, 6.5% share of the U.S. population. And we're now at 58 million in the U.S., and 18% of the general population. And according to the Pew Charitable Trust, just this week, they put out that 72% of us Latinos speak Spanish at home. So I think the importance of a Spanish language media is not something that is like, well, shouldn't be anyway, in the back burner, but rather something that folks should pay attention to. It's a lot of folks. And in California, essentially, I don't think you can get anything past the California legislature now without the pen of a Latino, because we control the Senate and we control the Assembly. So nothing goes through. So that's where we've come. But I want to talk about how Radio Bilingüe has played a part today in, has played a part in the development and history, particularly of California, but just in general. And we have the same values as the public broadcasters. We are part of the public broadcasting family. We believe in the integrity of what we put on the air. We don't accept money from tobacco companies or liquor companies or anybody who's on the AFL-CIO boycott list. We understand that our community is vulnerable. Our core audience earns less than $35,000 a year. Our core audience probably has like a high school education or less. That's why we have these policies. And we also don't play narco corridos, and we don't promote drugs or violence. That includes violence against women. And we also don't allow any of our songs to be played that in any way degrade, gays and lesbians and so on, which is very common on commercial Spanish language media. And so what we do in public affairs, and we the founders from the beginning thought that the heart of our and soul of our familias are obviously our cultura. And so we are not Spanish speaking only, we're bilingual, so that's why it's Radio Bilingüe. And to be correct, actually, now it should be like Radio Multilingüe, because we are in fact also broadcasting indigenous languages like Mixteco, which is the language of my people. I'm a Mixteco from Oaxaca, Mexico, immigrant. And also we also broadcast in Triqui, in our full power FM station in Salinas. And so that station broadcasts to the Triqui population because it too, within the context of indigenous in Mexico or the Americas, is among the most vulnerable. There's only about 50,000 Triquis, and about 5,000 are within our service area in Salinas. And then in terms of us Mixtecos, there's about 3 million of us. And of course, our homeland is in the northern part of the state of Oaxaca, southern part of the state of Guerrero and Puebla. But anyway, in one of our beats, our beats include areas of education, which is typical of, if you take out any, surveys of what Latinos are interested in. We cover those. You hear about education, you hear about economic opportunity, you hear about immigration, you talk about health access. So we cover those beats. And of course, we also cover the arts and literature. And so if you look at immigration, that has been something that we have followed very closely for a lot of reasons, including that literally it's a life-changing situation for many of our families. Just in Fresno, the city of Fresno and also LA, 1 out of 5 children in LA Unified or Fresno Unified has 1 or 2 undocumented parents. I mean, that's, that gives you a sense of the dimension of why right now, for example, there's a lot of fear among the Latino community, and that includes our audience. So if you look at, looking back at Radio Bilingüe's history, we were there when we covered the immigration debates, in the mid-'80s, leading to the Simpson-Rodino bill, which legalized some 3 million folks, and which opened doors to economic opportunities, et cetera, and coming out of the shadows. So Radio Bilingüe provides a daily forum, live forum. We have a talk show called Línea Abierta that began in 1995, which literally was modeled after Talk of the Nation. That was part of National Public Radio. I think that was abandoned like 3 or 4 years ago. But so you get a sense of that. But talk in Spanish, particularly for our families, is really, really critical. It's something that, it's a way for people to communicate, to learn, et cetera. And so we also covered in the 90s the backlash in some of the places like in the Midwest against the migration of Mexicans and Latinos moving into particularly the Midwest. So we cover that, and of course, it's not just the Midwest, California. Pete Wilson, and his, folks like him who pushed for literally a proposal, and that proposal went beyond that, a proposition that effectively, proposed to get rid of services for the undocumented. Eventually, it lost in the courts, but that happened. I guess that's a representation of that. And then also the abolition of bilingual education in our schools. That passed and became law. And we had no luck in getting that overturned until this year. So anyway, but that's something that we covered in terms of the hostility. And now, of course, that we're covering many triumphs of our within our legislature in the state of California that are very pro-Latino and pro-immigrant. We're a sanctuary state, where other cities may struggle. Our entire state is a sanctuary. So those are some of the things that we've covered. And there's a degree of identification and comfort, but those that understand the mission of Radio Bilingüe and how important Radio Bilingüe is. So when Rosa Maria Hernandez, an indigenous woman from the state of Oaxaca, where I'm from, when her child was taken away at the birth because she could not speak Spanish or English, and therefore was considered by the courts to not be fit to be a mother and mother her child. It was an activist person from the state of Alabama who called Radio Bilingüe and asked that we put that story out. And we did, and it became a national mainstream story, including the New York Times, and eventually she recovered her child. But that's and by the way, we also get calls like that from occasionally from people who are caught up, how would I say, victims of the narcos in Mexico. That's something that also, so we're not just recognized as a Latino U.S. service, but a transnational service. In fact, we broadcast in Mixteco, and we have been since about 2000 by satellite, all the way to Oaxaca, our homeland. On Sundays, we take over the airwaves in that way. What I want to do is also tell you like what's in the archives, because already we do have some of our, much of our content on the archives of the Library of Congress. We could use some more help, by the way, of some grad students to finish the job. But among the what's in the archives now, and you can visit the Library of Congress archives, are the first day broadcast of Radio Bilingüe. And it's interesting how that came about. Actually, we didn't care about taping it. It's interesting, right? It was actually one of our supporters who I didn't even know. He was actually the second attorney, Mexican-American attorney in the whole San Joaquin Valley, in whole Central Valley, who got his tape recorder and taped it. And about 2 years ago, before his death, gave it to Radio Bilingüe, and that's how it's saved. So, and then for the first 10 years, we actually used, because of the economic situation, we literally had a bulking machine where we erased programs on tape because of economic reasons. We didn't think about preserving, but obviously now we know the value, and now we're literally taping every second of our broadcast. And then we have the Simpson-Rodino law reform. We had a whole series on that. A symposium on Ernesto Galarza. I don't know if any one of you know who Ernesto Galarza was. He was a community organizer and intellectual, by the way. Had a doctorate as well, and was very interested in the Bracero program. And it was actually he who was, some say, is responsible for raising awareness about the exploitation of braceros, and that's why, you know, it was erased from being a U.S. program. We have interviews with Lydia Mendoza, for example, in our studios, Lalo Guerrero, and these are, how would I say, traditional music stars. Lydia from Texas, and Lalo Guerrero from Arizona, and then California. And then we also have Lourdes Huerta, Valerio Longoria, a Tejano, traditional music, accordion player. Bert Corona, another community organizer, originally from Arizona, and then went on to California, and so on. And so we have, a lot of voices, including those of our listeners, and that's something that we pride a lot, take a lot of pride in. And I wanted to just quote, because we do have over-the-air fundraising, and even though our listenership do not have much disposable income, we do every year for about a week. We get on the air, just like other public radio stations, and ask for financial support. So there's some notes that I want to read from some of the people that, when asked, why do you want to make, a $35 contribution? And from Crystal City, Texas, where we have a radio station, you'll hear something like, this is Angelic from Cristal. It says, Radio Bilingüe is a communication channel that has helped me a lot. It identifies itself with the poor, humble people, and with immigrants. It is a blessing and a reflection of what is going on here. And then another, it says, Rosa Isela from Merced says, I'm a huge fan of La Onda Tejana show, which is on Saturdays. Radio Bilingüe is one of the few public stations that really lives up to its mission with a mix of information, music, and PSAs. And then another one says, Carmen from Riverdale, I greatly appreciate Radio Bilingüe's programming, especially your information programs. I have learned a lot by listening to Radio Bilingüe. I also like that you treat people with much respect. So with that, what I want to do is, let's see if we can play the audio. Do I do it here or?
Are you scanning through the radio? You just made the right choice. You're listening to Radio Bilingüe.
Aguas con el calor.
Si trabajas al aire libre, toma medidas para prevenir una insolación.
This is a big deal, isn't it, for Imperial County, for all of California, I suppose. Juvenile Justice Men.
WIC es el programa de nutrición para mujeres, bebés y niños. El condado de Tulare tiene 9 oficinas.
Insu hugontatu ko onavali, bachi vishinjibanya, sani hugonya shikonache.
You're thinking about eating those 22 packs of sugar, are you, honey?
Why not, Mom? You drink them every day.
What are you talking about?
Comienza hoy mismo. Lleva a tu hijo a la biblioteca. No hay mejor manera de aprender que explorando juntos las maravillas de los libros.
Visita latinopopmatters.org.
We have a great listening audience, and they know their music in mariachi, oldies, tejano, salsa, cumbias, trance, and so much more. We are
Radio Bilingüe.
Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Monica de la Torre, and I'm honored to be here with this amazing panel of Spanish language and multilingual radio. And I'm especially honored to be sitting next to Rosa Ramon, one of the co-founders, the only woman co-founder of Radio Cadena, the nation's first full-time Spanish language non-commercial radio station in the United States that was founded, went on air in 1979, and was just completely revolutionized the ways in which we understand Spanish language radio, particularly when it comes to intentionally incorporating women into broadcasting as producers, as news directors, as station manager. Rosa was the first station manager of Radio Cadena. And so today I'm just going to go briefly into our work together in attempting to archive and preserve the history of Radio Cadena. It is located in Granger, Washington, which is in eastern Washington, and it's the agricultural hub of the area. A lot of farm workers, especially Spanish-speaking, Mexican-American Chicanos that beginning in the 1950s migrated to the Pacific Northwest to work in the hops, apples, cherries, asparagus, you name it, they're there. So it's important for me to particularly bring awareness to the fact that women have been, from the beginning, a vital component of community radio production. And this is an image here. I'm going to go through some of the images that we've been able to digitize, and because of Rosa's efforts right from the beginning to document and preserve the history of the station, Cadena has a really rich visual and sonic archive. And so this is an image here. You see Rosa also there in the image, sitting on the truck, constructing the tower on a Tandem Ridge right outside of Granger. And this is a map of the work that Radio Cadena did from the beginning to begin to address the lack of Spanish language news in broadcasting. Prior to this, Spanish language news was translated from English and didn't really speak to the issues that communities were interested in. And so Radio Cadena and their organizing efforts beginning in 1975 created the Spanish language news network that you see here, a map of all the different radio stations, both that included commercial stations, of how they were able to create and produce news, and Rosa can probably speak better about this than I can. But here is another image of the radio station now, and you see here the logo, the farm worker, that is really vital to Radio Cadena as being the voice of the farm worker, la voz del campesino. And so I wanted to play really quickly a clip of one of the women that was involved in the radio trainee program, Celia Pietro, who speaks about what it meant to her to learn broadcasting, but also to have the support of women. So I'll play that. And then I'll let Rosa speak for a bit.
Celia Pietro was born in Mexico. She is a wife and a mother to a young 5-year-old child. A farm worker for most of her young 23 years, Celia's experience with Radio Cadena began as a trainee in radio broadcasting. Now she is Radio Cadena's public affairs producer.
Being a public affairs producer is exciting. Some of the things I have to do is screen 3 to 4 newspapers a day for news relevant to the Chicano community, plus information and news releases that come into the station daily. I also cover local news stories which require research, interviews, attending meetings, and press conferences. Then I have to write my scripts for the 2 news programs I produce. Producing news takes a lot of time, plus raising a family, but my family is very understanding. My daughter sometimes is very proud of me. She tells all her friends that her mommy is a disc jockey. My family is very proud of me too because they can't believe that I'm working in a radio station. I thought that I better get into something else besides farm work, and I thought I would give my parents something to be proud of, to be in a radio station and be a mother and raise a family and work at the same time and do something that will help the community. I plan to take some classes for communications. The very first time I did the news live, it was my first time. I was very, very nervous. And after my news was over, I came out and Rosa and Estela were waiting for me at the door and they were applauding me. And that made me feel really good because I get a lot of support from them, and I think that's what keeps me going.
So I love that clip for many reasons. One, we hear, to be able to hear Celia's voice, some of the programming that specifically was about women, that Radio Cadena had a program called Mujer, or Woman. A lot of those shows, as Hugo mentioned earlier, are not archived because of a lack of resources. A lot of the tapes were reused. And so to be able to have this gem of being able to listen to Celia talk about how important it was for her to get into broadcasting, in very practical means of finding different employment outside of farm work, I think is important. And then the fact that she doesn't have to negotiate her different identities as a mother, as a woman, as somebody that's interested in radio, that all those aspects of her identity were embraced and put on air through the programming and through her voice. So with that, I want to hand it over to Rosa and show you a few more images. And I just want to say how wonderful it's been to work with Rosa. I met her as a graduate student, and I interviewed her for a project called Women Who Rock. And it's an oral history project that documents social activism and music and other sonic communities. And the first time I met her, I also have a background in radio like a lot of us here. And I just was so excited that I had met another Chicana that, paved the way for someone like myself. So I'll let Rosa say a little bit about the work that we've been doing in archiving. She's been really instrumental. We've gone to the station together to look for things, to look for programs, any sort of archive that we can start to preserve this really important history.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad that you're joining us today. And I hope that I don't bore you. When Monica approached me, I tried to avoid her. I was getting ready to retire and thinking of having a life of ease, right? And it was really her passion for wanting to make sure that this information was recorded. This story about Radio Cadena, this story about the women, because in much of the history of the social movement, women actually, especially even in the Chicano movement, women have kind of been left out of the picture. And so her enthusiasm to make sure that all of this was archived, was recorded, was going to be in a position to be shared, inspired me to get busy and to help her with her project. And I did not know at the time, she mentioned the photography, I did not know at the time when, we were all quite young when we started the radio station, and I'm quite poor as well. And one of the first things I did when I had enough money was to buy a camera, just a little Minolta camera that cost $100, which then was a lot of money. And so I began to photograph everything. That's one of my pictures. The one in the truck is one of my pictures. I photographed the station from the beginning when we went to visit KBBF in Santa Rosa, California, which was the first bilingual station in the country. And none of us had experience in radio. And so we learned that there was a station in Santa Rosa. And so we took a group of us there to talk to them. And so I have photographs from those early periods. Also, because we were poor, we did all of our construction on our radio station by hand. We did the tower. We were not engineers, but with the help of one engineer, we got volunteers, community volunteers. So it was really a station that was built by the community. So we did the tower, we put up the antenna, we dug the holes on the mountain. Our tower is located on Yakima National Tribal Land. We worked with them on getting a reasonable price. And so we did all of the digging and the moving of the rocks. Everything was done by hand for Radio Cadena. It's a very special radio station in that it's way up in the Northwest. Many people didn't even know there were Spanish people living in the Northwest at the time. And when the station first went on the air, our audience was really not immigrants, because the first arrivals to do agriculture work in the state of Washington were American citizens, Texans, people from California, people from the Midwest that moved into Washington state, but primarily Tejanos. And then later on, as of course, immigration increases, the station, of course, which is one of the beautiful things about radio, is its flexibility to be able to really focus on the needs of its community. It was able to then adjust itself to meet the needs of, the immigrants that were moving into the valley. So its programming has changed over the years, but initially it was a U.S. citizen, Spanish-speaking audience. So that's just a little bit of the history. And to just put in context why it's so rare that this station actually succeeded in the Northwest is because that area is extremely rural, poor, very agricultural, very extremely conservative. All of the political positions are held by the representatives of the agricultural industry. And so there was a lot of fear about the station coming into that area. And just, I don't want to say a lot because there's just too much. I woke up at 3 o'clock this morning trying to think of what I should say to you, going back and looking at this 50-year history, and I thought, So I just want to give you one example of what we dealt with. I was invited to speak to a religious, denomination doesn't matter, but a religious group. And one of the questions that they asked me in this interview, they wanted to know about Radio Cadena, was, what do we say to our parishioners when they think that your people are no higher than the animals? So that was one of the first questions that I dealt with when our station first went in the air. So it gives you an idea of why it's so remarkable that the first Spanish language radio station should come out of this tiny, poor town in the state of Washington, and that it has accomplished what it has done in terms of one very important issue, tackling AIDS within the Latino community. It was horrible, and there wasn't any information going out in Spanish. Radio Cadena took that on and did a national program in Spanish. It did a radio drama series in Spanish to educate the Latino community. So that's the kind of station, that it is. And I don't want to go in too long. It's just too much. But I thank you for being here, and I'm happy to answer any questions later, too.
And then we'll have Joyce, and then wrap it up for our colleagues in Caribbean Radio. Oops. Hold on a minute, sorry. I think it was this one.
Do you have to escape the other one? Escape
I think I do. Oh, no, there it goes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I want to see this place filled. I'm the executive director for the Latino Public Radio Consortium, and we represent and service over 50 Latino public radio stations, such as KDNA, Radio Bilingüe, and the services that we provide to the station is working towards their sustainability. We host an annual Latino summit where we bring all of the stations together. And when you think of us as a national organization, and you look at just the two examples that you saw of two very distinctive, long-serving radio stations, and you look at radio stations like Latino Public Radio in Rhode Island, which has a large Puerto Rican population. You look at WDNA, which is in Miami, an all-jazz station. They put on the first Latino Jazz Festival last year. And then you look at another one, like Lancaster, Pennsylvania, WLCH, whose parent organization has a tech center, they have a senior citizen center, and their radio station is very well known in the community and very well integrated. And when you look at the role that the consortium plays in being a national umbrella, we look at what are the commonalities of support that we can provide to them. And so for us, it lies in collaboration, talent, and training. And these three things also are important when we're talking about preservation. Yesterday, Jennifer Lawson at the Pug Media 50 said something that for me was so key and so important, and I had to give a shout out to her on Twitter. And she said, preservation, national, yes, but let's not forget local communities. And that is so significant, and I'm gonna give you a very unfortunate and vibrant picture of that. And that relates to what is happening in Puerto Rico. We have 5 Latino public radio stations that have been dramatically affected by the hurricane. Obviously, preservation and collection of all of the historical news information that they hone has become a huge and significant concern for us. WIPR, who is a state responder, is on air. WRTU is working to get on air. The consortium is very, very fortunate to be working in collaboration with public media stations that have come forward to support. There are still stations that are off the air. There are still stations whose collections are not being air conditioned, are not being humidified, and part of the work that the consortium is doing is to make sure that we preserve that. We're thankful, obviously, to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. They have been our major funder since the inception of the Latino Public Radio Consortium. They have played a major role in providing emergency funding to these stations, and they have also played a major role in bringing forth stations that can support us. Coast Alaska had these radio-to-go kits. If you're not familiar with them, you can go up on Coast Alaska, but they're ready-to-go kits that they thought of when they would have an emergency in terms of being able to continue to broadcast. And so these type of collaborations are so significant when we're speaking to the preservation of news, when we're speaking to the preservation of talent. And I'm not suggesting that we take human bodies and put them in preservations, but one of the radio stations, and I don't know if you know this, I should say one of the radio stations, but they're a dual broadcaster. They ceased operations indefinitely. And on the same day that they ceased operations, they let go of all their staff. We created a GoFundMe to be able to help the stations, but the question behind that is that when you look at the growth of public media, and you look at the work that these stations do in the local community, we all know, and just in the pictures that she showed, that in public media, when you enter public media as a talent, you start as a trainee, you start as a volunteer. Some of us are more fortunate and start in specific roles, but you have a tendency to stay for a very long time. Radio has that kind of effect, no? And so our concerns are with talent and the growth of Latino public media with respect to being able to look at that there is the potential that Latino radio stations that are struggling because they have one or two team members, because they have volunteers that come and go, because the universities are not able to gear them into public media as a career path. Now I'm speaking to Latino populations, right? When you consider how long and hard NPR has been working to increase Latino talent, this is all part of preservation. And collaboration is so significant to that. As a consortium, we serve over 50 stations. We're a two-people staff. So needless to say, I don't sleep a lot. And the other thing about that is, had it not been for Coast Alaska to come forward with the Radio to Go kits, had it not been for WNYC to offer their engineers to fly to Puerto Rico to help WIPR-FM get back on air, had it not been for WMFE Orlando, who delivered the second radio kit and worked with their own partners to get a charter plane to deliver the equipment, the collaboration of public media is significant to the preservation of Latino radio stations. The local community and the work and all of the news, when you think about the California fires, I think of KBBF, one of the only radio stations that was able to cover information and news in Spanish, okay? Radio Bilingüe also did a lot of important interviews. They did so with respect to Puerto Rico, even though their population is predominantly Mexican. So our role as a consortium is to bring forth collaboration so that we can continue to grow Latino media, specifically radio. When I think of KSVR, within the CPB, we support 11 stations that are CSG qualified. For that, that means that is the funding that the corporation provides to us. They are our predominant funder. So we are required to specifically service those 11 stations. We have 50 that want to be serviced. And so the collaboration of entities that come forth, like WNYC, WMFE, are so significant. And when I look at just the public media system as a whole and our vision to make it a more inclusive public media, I would love to see more partnerships. I would love to see the consortium contacted by general market stations to look at ways to support our growth, our local stations in all of the different markets. That is preservation of media. To be able to look at the current problems that we're facing, and you spoke to Radio Vieques. Radio Vieques is off air. They have been off air. However, they took a truck, put 2 speakers on it, and they have been roaming throughout the island of Vieques, ensuring news, ensuring information, ensuring resources. And we're hoping in another week to be able to issue a press release that will give insight to our work in getting Radio Vieques back on air. And interestingly enough, when you look at Puerto Rico and all of the different topics that have surfaced with respect to Puerto Rico being a colony, am I a U.S. citizen? Because yes, I am Puerto Rican. And the history of Puerto Rico, you know, I don't know how many of you know, there is the Fundación Luz Muñoz Marín, which has over 100 years of archival collections, which is American history. And the reason it's American history is because Puerto Ricans are American, and I'm not being facetious in saying this, I need to repeat it. And because Luis Muñoz Marín was a very loved governor, had a very close and wonderful friendship with Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller. There are letters and videos and audios and so much wonderful information that our radio stations go to this foundation to obtain. And through a separate role, I was fortunate to work very closely with the Luz Muñoz Marín Foundation, and I was in awe of the amount of American history that they have. And I even wonder how many of our public media stations utilize it, know about it. All of the stations in Puerto Rico turn to them when they're looking for historical data. So my message, which I hope that these very few of you who are here in this audience will take to all of your colleagues, is the consortium needs collaborations. There, KSVR, which I started to mention before and my mind deviated for a moment, in Mount Vernon has a growing population, and they're thwarted because they're limited in their ability to provide content, and they air in English. And they don't only air to a Latino audience. So my question is, how do I sit sleepless nights trying to figure out how I help KSVR enhance their programming when there is a wealth of public media system executives with talent, expertise, knowledge, content? And so that's my message. I would love to see our local community stations continue to thrive. I would love to know that our Puerto Rico stations do not have to cease operations, that despite what has happened with the hurricane, that there are ways, and the only way that that can happen is through the support of our colleagues. That's the only way. Am I past my time?
That was perfect.
Okay. Thank you. I really thank you so much. If you really want to know who our radio stations are, on our website, when you go to publications, there's a publication called A Snapshot. It gives a very detailed insight on each single radio station. If you want to know how you can help our Puerto Rico stations, on our homepage, there's a GoFundMe, but there is also a list of all of the different things that we're doing to help bring the Puerto Rico stations back to full capacity. We know we will get them back on air on a short-term basis, but we need the public media system to be able to help not only Puerto Rico, but all of our radio stations. So thank you.
We might not have time for questions right now because I want to give time for the Caribbean scholars to speak, and maybe after that.
Okay.
So I hope we can all stick around.
Okay. All righty. Well, it's my pleasure to be here. As Inez said, my specialization is in U.S. and Mexican broadcasting history, but I got interested from the scholarly perspective in Latina media and radio in particular because it's such an interesting history. It's the story of American radio, and so I see that as something that it needs to be included in the broader picture. So I guess I would just stick to a few points here. I think the panelists have made excellent arguments about the essential everyday role that radio plays in the community, and particularly for Latinos. And that's the fundamental thing, but also is the sort of cultural mission, the sort of giving a cultural outlet. And this reminds me of the research of Clemencia Rodriguez in Colombia, who sort of looks at, it's the process of making radio that constructs the community. And I think all these cases have really showed the importance of that. The other couple of issues I would just bring up is a couple of interesting things, I think. One is that while this is, on the one hand, a national story, it's also fundamentally transnational, right? All of the communities have ties to other parts of the world, to parts of Latin America. And those ties are part of the story. And so we need to think of it not just in a national context, but in a transnational context. And then finally, I think all these cases really show that these are local or regional cultures, right, that are using the medium of radio. And that presents difficulties, I guess, around preservation. And I think obviously, as we've discussed, the idea of collaboration is what's going to make this, bring these local and regional expressions and uses of radio into sort of broader national picture and transnational picture of what Spanish language, multilingual radio is all about. So those are just the points I wanted to make, and I've really enjoyed hearing from all the panelists.
This is a great panel.
Great. So we're just going to get started. We don't have too much time, but I'm told that there's nothing here until 2 o'clock. So if we want to stay a little bit longer, if you're not too hungry, we can. It's really an honor to be here. It's an honor to share this time with all of these amazing people, and I'm really inspired by the presentations that I just heard, and I really hope that we can have a good conversation afterwards. It's also an honor to be to have sort of been able to convene this panel with these incredibly distinguished archivists, librarians, and researchers. And what I'm going to do is just quickly introduce everybody and without much further ado, get going. So we have to my left, Craig Braden, who has been the audiovisual archivist at Duke University's Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library, and prior to that was head of media and oral history at the Russell Library at the University of Georgia. At Duke, he processes and advises on AV and oral history collections, and since 2015, he's managed Voices of Change, which is a 2.5-year project funded by NEH to preserve and describe the recordings of Radio Haiti, which is Haiti's Voice of Democracy. And if you don't know about that project, he will tell you more about it. The other two people who are working on that project were not able to be here today, but it's quite an amazing collection. He will be followed by Cristina Hernandez, who's currently curator of special collections at the Latin American Library at Tulane University. She has a master's and PhD in anthropology from Tulane and has published widely on the archaeology of Mesoamerica, specializing in the prehistory of Michoacán and the Bajío regions of North and Central Mexico, and pre-Hispanic painted Maya and Highland Mexican codices. She is also the principal collaborator and responsible for the electronic resource, the Maya Codices database. And today she's going to be talking about, I hope, maybe, a collection of Cuban radionovelas
which is really interesting. Jeff Rubin, her colleague, is the head of digital initiatives and publishing at Howard Tilton Memorial Library at Tulane. He oversees the Tulane University Digital Library, Tulane Journal Publishing, and Electronic Theses and Dissertations program as part of the Tulane University Digital Repository. Over the past 18 years, Jeff has worked on numerous collaborative digital library projects with regional, international, and national partners. His work at Tulane focuses on developing new digital library projects with collaborators from across Tulane's campus and in building Tulane's open access publishing unit. So we have all of these people who really sort of know what they're doing in terms of archiving. It's an honor. And finally, as one of our panelists, we have, or actually joining the session, she may or may not be chiming in. We have Ayana Legros, who is a first-year history PhD student, and she's sitting on a really important radio archive that we hope to sort of get going on preserving as part of this initiative. Our commenter today will be Robert Horton, who's from the National Museum of American History, and he's Assistant Director of Collections and Archives. And I should say that I'm Alejandra Bronfman. I teach Caribbean and Latin American history at SUNY Albany. So, Christine. Thank you. Oh, sorry, Craig.
Okay.
Sorry.
Turn it off. Good morning. Thank you for being here. I'm honored and humbled to be among a group of people here who are doing really cool things, and both creators and archivists and people who are interested in what we're doing. It's a great thing, so thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit about our Radio Haiti collection at Duke University. And this is coming from somebody who, admittedly, I'm an audiovisual archivist. I work on a wide variety of projects. I don't have the language to be working on this project. I don't have the cultural background to be working on this project. The person who actually probably should be sitting in my seat is the person I manage on the project, Laura Wagner, who's a brilliant scholar and writer, and she is our soldier on this project. So I'm going to try to represent what she's doing as best as I can as the manager of the project. So the Radio Haiti project, it's a preservation project, it's a description project, it's a repatriation project, and behind all of that, it's a human rights project. And this is what really draws me to it and keeps my heart in it. A little bit of background. Radio Haiti, as a political source and the voice of democracy in Haiti, began in 1971 when Jean Dominique, the station's owner, bought the station. And over the next 30 years, he and his wife, Michelle Montas, created this voice of democracy. And they kept going, even when the station was off the air and they were in exile in New York City. They came back twice to Haiti before Jean Dominique was assassinated in 2000. If you're interested in that story, and it's an amazing story, Jonathan Demme made a movie about him. It's a documentary. It's called The Agronomist. In 2013, 10 years after the station closed, because Michelle kept the station open for another 3 years after the assassination, she made a donation to Duke University of the 3,700 tapes, which equals out to 5,300 digital files, about 2,700 hours of audio. We secured an NEH grant in 2015, and with our obligation in that grant to provide digital preservation of the audio and also basic description of the tapes. They came with some metadata already. They came with some titles, but that information was often incomplete and sometimes incorrect because, that's the way it goes. And the couple of years I spent in a radio station, sometimes the labels weren't always as correct as they probably could be. So I think we understood that. So part of this collection and the impetus behind it was the collecting forces of our human rights archive, one of our collecting centers. Duke, the Rubenstein Library at Duke, the Special Collections Library, wants more and more to be seen as an activist library. And this was really really a good example of a collection that we could sink our teeth into. But it also came smack up against the culture at Duke, which, you know, is a traditional research center, American research library. It's very traditional. It wants to be an activist library, but it also really hews to the lines of standards, which is great. We really use a lot of what's called MPLP, which is more product, less process in our archiving. And so the idea of spending a lot of time doing item level description on audio was not something that I think a lot of the people sort of in the leadership were prepared for going forward. So we had some challenges early on there. And the needs of the collection really sort of really brought those challenges into relief. This was a collection that needed multilingual description for accessibility. That meant that we had to have playback of the entire file that we got back from Cutting Corporation, which was the company that digitized the tapes and did a great job. And that was actually the easy part for us. We needed an understanding of the context of the audio's creation. And this was really important to really make sensible metadata. And really, most of all, an understanding of the absolute importance of Haitian Creole as used by the station, because it was revolutionary for its time. They were the first media outlet in Haiti to use Haitian Creole, which was the language of the people. And in processing the collection and working with it, that is really more and more has become, in my mind, the driving force of the collection and its continued importance. Its political importance to the people of Haiti, its importance as it was used by the station, the language that the station used, the way they used the language. They went a long way towards making parts of that language concrete. And so really understanding the collection is an understanding of Haitian Creole. So that required a lot of expertise, which we got very lucky and were able to hire Laura Wagner to do the processing of the collection. So Laura sits and she listens to audio and she describes it. And she brings to bear on that audio a cultural expertise and cultural context and history of Haiti that is really just outstanding. And there are a lot of problems regarding especially authorities, controlled vocabularies. LC headings don't really do for these kinds of collections. LC headings are not really tuned to, or I should say that maybe they have they bring all the cultural baggage of sort of mainstream America with it, right? So they don't really think about how place names might be constructed in Haiti. They might not think about how personal names are constructed in Haiti. They might not think about the way that certain events happened, or the way that certain events happened might be through the lens of an American imperialism. So in processing the collection and wanting to apply authorities and controlled vocabularies so records could be searched effectively across collections, it was a real challenge for us. And we do a lot of basically local controlled vocabulary in describing the collection. We have database issues with it. As a trilingual collection, well, this actually goes back to the importance of the Haitian Creole, but we started out just using a relational database to try to wrangle everything together. But the problem with that was we had difficulty copying records, which is really important when you're creating 5,100 records or 5,300 records. And the other issue was that we needed to be able to get the information out into a flat spreadsheet, which we weren't sure we could do by the end of the project. So we went ahead and ported the database out to a flat spreadsheet. Well, that spreadsheet, because the metadata has to be trilingual, has over 100 fields in it. And to then ingest that into a developing digital repository has its own set of complications. Amidst all of this, we have to remain very flexible and very live in our approach to how we process the collection. Laura, as brilliant as she is, can't do it all on her own in the time that we have to do it. So we have to try to find other people with similar talents, the language skills, to be able to help us on it. Well, you can imagine that that population at Duke University is fairly small. And we like to use students when possible because it keeps our costs down. It gives the students experience. And in fact, we've had some great success with some of our students, but students graduate. And Duke has a hard time hiring outside the university. We actually just got through a whole process of trying to rehire a student after she graduated, which set the project back probably several months. We've just learned that we can actually rehire her, but it took us 4 months to do it. Duke is a large ship. It's very powerful. It's well-resourced, but it's very slow to turn. And so we want, within the archive, though, we want to make good on that activist promise. And we want to be able to say we can do these kinds of collections because they're important. And I told Michelle Montas this the other week when I saw her, as I had told her before, that I really felt like this was the most important collection I'll work on in my lifetime, in my career. And I really, truly believe that. And this is a collection where I don't even understand the content when I listen to it. But the description is going to make that more accessible to all of us in the end. And in our next steps, we hope that we can go beyond our repository, which is very useful if you're a researcher in the US, but is less so when you're in Haiti. And we want to actually digitally repatriate it, hopefully, if we get our grant fulfilled, using YouTube and the Internet Archive to go where Haitians are in Haiti, because that's where they are. And to us, that's our frontier, to push an academic library to actually use that resource in such a way that it's effective is really our next step. And luckily, we have the rights clearances to be able to do that. So that's a thumbnail of the work on Radio Haiti.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Alejandro, for the invitation to talk with you, be on the panel. Thanks also to Josh Shepard and the Radio Preservation Task Force for having their conference this year and giving us the opportunity to speak with everyone. So this morning I'm going to talk a little bit about a collection that we have in the Special Collections of the Latin American Library at Tulane University. It's called the Luis J. Bueri and Menin Bujones Bueri Collection of Cuban-American radio novelas. The collection measures 630 linear feet of material, the bulk of which are audio tapes. And in fact, the collection measures approximately, in terms of the audio series, it's a little under 9,000 individual tapes. This is quarter-inch polyester audio tape on 7-inch reels. And that probably represents close to 3,600 hours of audio recordings. The tapes actually, they represent the library of radio program masters that were produced by America's Productions Incorporated, or API. And this is a company that was based out of Miami, Florida. It was founded in 1961 by Luis J. Bueri. Now, prior to the 1959 Cuban Revolution, Cuba was a major producer of radio programming, supplying as much as 75% of the canned radio programs that were distributed to stations throughout Latin America. That was significantly impacted by the 59 revolution. And it also meant the end to Bueri's career as a public relations man in Havana. So after the revolution, he resettled in Miami, as did much of the talent that existed in Cuba prior to the revolution, the people who actually helped to produce these radio programs. So the actors, the actresses, directors, scriptwriters, musicians, technicians, many of these folks resettled in Miami after 1959. And so what Boeri was able to do was actually fill that industry void for programming production by founding API and by making use of the talent that had pooled there in Miami after 1959. Now the company kind of began its first couple years producing very pointed anti-communist programs for the US government, a number of which were commissioned by Voice of America for broadcast back to Cuba. But what Boeri found was that in order to keep his company commercially viable, he was going to have to kind of shift the focus of the production of programs. And so in 1963, he kind of put the resources of the company towards producing what he called pure entertainment. And so this was going to be programming that was more pro-democracy, pro-capitalist in nature, something that one of our colleagues mentioned yesterday in one of the Cold War sessions, kind of propaganda as entertainment. And so the idea was that these would be programs that he could actually license to stations and where they would be able to broadcast them because they weren't so outwardly, obviously, anti-communist. But these were, the programming were primarily radio novellas or radio dramas, radio soap operas, but they also included mystery and suspense shows, they did informationals, they did comedy programs, they did variety programs. So there's a whole range of programming that they were producing in this short stretch between 1963 and 1970. And they licensed the programs to stations throughout Latin America, but also, more importantly, to the burgeoning Spanish-speaking audiences in the United States and to Spanish markets in Europe. So they had a wide distribution. But I'm not really here this morning to talk to you all about the content of this collection. What I really wanted to talk with you is how I and my colleagues at Tulane are trying to put these programs back on the air, so to speak. How to convert them, make them accessible to the public again. And the collection came to Tulane at the end of 2004. In 2005, the Latin American Library had a graduate student who was working to do the rough inventory of the materials, and she was able to dub a few of the tapes onto CDs and started to do a condition assessment of the tapes. But that all kind of abruptly came to an end with Hurricane Katrina. The playback equipment that the library had was destroyed by the flooding. And so for the intervening 10 years after that, the tapes, the work can continue on that project until 2015. Then the Latin American Library was again in a position to kind of return to that project. Also, the parent library, Howard Tilton, was also had digital capacity by that point. So we had my colleague Jeff here. We had the Tulane University Digital Library was in place, and so we actually had more digital capacity to kind of come back to this project. So is this the right moment? So in order to begin in 2015, the first thing we had to do was establish the copyright status. These are tapes that were produced in the kind of the donut hole of copyright. Apart from the donor agreement, I didn't have any documentation about the multiple different rights holders that might have been involved in the production of these programs. And we really need to be sure that if we're going to digitize these materials and put them online and make them open access available, that we were not going to have any issues. So it took 8 months working with Tulane's Office of the General Counsel and with other professionals in the field like James Hurdle and Elizabeth Townsend Guard from Tulane's Law School to actually get our copyright information in order. We were ready to go ahead. So the next step was to then devise a pilot project. I don't have a background in audio preservation, and nor had we any kind of workflow to deal with the conversion of analogs to digital recordings. So the purpose of the pilot project was to kind of learn that. And what we did was I made a selection of tapes. I knew we had some condition issues to think about. We knew that there was some mold. We knew that there were a number of poor pack conditions. And so the point of the pilot project really was just to figure out how much was it going to cost to convert these tapes, what were the workflows, how much labor were we going to need to manage the digital files, create the metadata, and then build a digital collection, because that was going to be the outlet for providing access. To fund this little project, I looked to a group. Tulane is a member of the Center for Research Libraries, and under the Center for Research Libraries, there is a project that is called the Latin American Research Resources Project. And the member institutions to CRL, part of their subscription, their yearly subscription monies are pooled, and the LARP, which is the name of the acronym for this group, LARP can then fund some small digitization initiatives for the member institutions. So we were fortunate to get a little over $8,000 to do that pilot project. We worked with George Blood Audio to help us with conversion, and we were able to actually do 194 tapes. So by the end of 2016, we had our 194 tapes digitized. They had some conservation done on them. They were digitized. We created the metadata, and we were able to get them up, get a digital collection up in the Tulane University Digital Library. We also at that time were able to complete a condition assessment of a 4% sample of the total number of audio tapes, so we had a good idea of what our condition issues were. And we now know about approximately how much in terms of funding and labor resources it's going to take to convert the entire library of 8,900 some tapes. Let me show you. Kind of went ahead of my. There's the homepage for the digital collection. We have 8 titles up there, 3 of them in their entirety, so we have all the episodes for the stories. Have a good sampling of some of the content. And we'll show you in a minute what the metadata looks like. Metadata is done both in English and Spanish. And so now in 2017, what we're able to continue to do is now we have the experience and the knowledge to to pursue some larger grant funding opportunities to keep going with the conversion. And at the moment, we're currently proceeding with doing kind of mold remediation and cleaning of the tapes, kind of to be ready for when we might be able to continue with conversion. Approximately 1/3 of the total collection of tapes has some condition issues, so we're just going to continue with that work. So with that, I'm going to hand the podium over to my colleague, Jeff Rubin, who's going to tell you a little bit more about some of the cool stuff that's happening on that end. Okay, Jeff.
Should I come up there?
If you like.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm not sure where I'm going here. So the collection, the process, actually, the part of the library that I oversee is the sort of production and access component of our collections, and how we have a platform that provides basically open access to all of our collection materials that we digitize. This, once we got into the position to be able to distribute these materials to make them available to anyone who wants to read them or to listen to them, we had sort of part of the process figured out. The difficulty, though, is that our proposal to go forward to have these tapes digitized was the cost of that portion didn't cover the cost of this initial cleaning and conservation of the tapes. So that is what we're having to do in-house and through Chris's students, here's a slide of our student worker, Rebecca, vacuuming and cleaning the reels and the boxes of each of these audio tapes. What we ended up coming across was that each tape was going to require somebody manually sort of cleaning the tape for the entire, one-to-one real-time running of each tape, which is a horrible job for somebody, and especially for a student. So we had this serendipitous meeting that Chris had with one of our new faculty at Tulane. His name is Felipe Cruz, and he is a Brazilian, and he is a Brazilian historian, historian of Brazil. And Chris had a meeting with him, and it turns out he was very interested in Tulane's makerspace. Tulane has a new 3D printing space, and with lots of equipment. Let me show you this. And we were trying to figure out how can we take the manual labor out of cleaning these tapes and just have them run. And Felipe and Chris and I were talking, and we came up with this idea to 3D print an extra reel, a set of these reels that the tape goes over and under and cleans the tape without having a student having to sort of hold the cloth and do it manually. So Felipe, he knew how to do this already, and he sort of just jumped in and wanted to design and build and print out this little gadget. And we have, it's not even a gadget, it's a widget, really. It's just a piece of solid plastic that printed out, and this makerspace is open to people on the campus for free. You can just go in and get sort of quickly certified to run the equipment, send files, and what we came up with was this. And so there's a video here that I will play, if I can find the presentation mode. It has stopped working. Let's see if I can get this back up. Did we have them up here? We didn't. Let me open this real quick. So the video, it just shows, this is it, huh? There we go, and if we can slideshow, play. What am I doing? Do we know, Chris, your thing is it here? Yeah. There we go. Let's see if. So we sort of had this printed and kind of attached it to the side of the machine, and it runs over. There's no tension really being applied to the tape, but it sort of gently goes over these cleaning materials and takes off the sort of layer of dust and sort of some of the loose iron oxide bits on the tape. To
maybe we can show it. Maybe you can find it after.
Yeah, we'll do this. So the other part of it. So now we have this other collaborator with us, this Felipe, who it turned out to be just perfectly timed to fall right into our labs. We couldn't have planned it any better. That is going on now. And so Craig is doing 3 languages. We're only doing 2, but the work of doing Spanish and English metadata is very time consuming. We are having all of the metadata in both of these languages, but we're also needing people to look at the content, to listen to the content, and describe that information. So when we should find out in late December whether we get funding to do that initial third of all of these tapes to do. And we've done another radio project at Tulane. We did a project for the WTUL, which is the Tulane University independent radio station. We have an archive of those materials. The only other audio project I've ever done was another radio broadcast, but this was a broadcast of jazz radio programs from the New Orleans Jazz Club. And I did this when I was at Louisiana State Museum, where I spent the first 20 years of my career. And so the main difference between, that was about 8 years ago, that project and this project. The difference between then and now is the equipment is no longer available to buy. Reel-to-reel decks are few and far between. There are very few manufacturers of reel-to-reel decks. The ones that are doing very high-end, $10,000 and up machines. So we had to go and find a deck on through a third-party company that goes and this is their passion. They go and they rebuild reel-to-reel decks. And currently we have one, and what we need to do is we need to find 2, 3, or 4 more so that we can have this sort of assembly line of tapes going at the same time. And so, yeah, my expertise in this is not in the content at all, but is really in the facilitation of the sort of analog to digital and then the publishing of this material. And so once we're done, all of this material will be open access and available to everybody. And then the key that we're trying to find out is how is this material going to be used? How do we add knowledge? How do we find people to use this material, add knowledge to it so it just doesn't become something sitting on a shelf that someone can listen to, but how is it going to be used in classroom? How can it be used for the study of various cultural aspects or history or economic aspects of it? And how do we get that into the classroom, whether it's K through 12 or higher education? So that's what we're looking at and trying to sort of figure out is hopefully we can get these materials used and become a resource for others. So that's what we have. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Robert now, and then Ayana, if you want to say a few things after Robert, that would be great, or not. Okay.
Great, thank you very much. Let me echo, let's start by echoing what a lot of people have said. Is first, thanks to Josh Shepard for putting together this extraordinary conference, and echo as well what I think people have said about what makes it extraordinary is that it crosses so many different boundaries. I mean, we've brought together scholars, we've brought together people in the IT world, archives world, communities, creators of content, users of content. And that's unique in many ways. I think most of us generally just meet amongst ourselves and talk to ourselves. Well, I certainly talk to myself, but I meant talk amongst ourselves. But what I think we're also experiencing, and certainly something that we need to address, is the fact that we all speak different languages as well. And the point I would make after having listened to the conversations over the past 2 days, and certainly this session as well, is that, and I'll borrow these terms with all apologies from Marx's Capital, is that the researchers in the communities, a lot of the users of the content speak about use value. When they look at a collection, they'll talk about, this would be great for a class. It's essential for my research. This tells the story of a community. And I think archivists, and especially those archivists like I who are managers of archives, talk in terms of exchange value. Collection is one opportunity among many. And I look at it and evaluate it in terms of resources and capacity and priorities. How am I going to deal with the challenges of mold? How am I going to deal with process of description? How am I going to do it when I have a limited budget? And the Smithsonian has a relatively large budget, but it's going down. I mean, all of us are increasingly looking to deal with the fact that in the cultural heritage world, our budgets are moving from a program-based to a project-based foundation, meaning that, for example, the Smithsonian, federal government pays essentially for buildings and staff. Everything else has to be raised. Funds have to be raised. And I think that's true as you listen to everyone talking today about these projects are all grant funded. When those grants go away, what happens? Increasingly, we're putting things together in this ad hoc, one project to another, hoping that it'll all come magically together at some point and things will be preserved and we'll make it all work. That's a tremendous challenge, and I think everyone's kind of underscored the fact that the answer to that is going to be collaboration. But I would add a couple of different things. One, I think of, how should I put this? I think collecting is always the easy part, and that collecting really needs to be addressed in terms of a continuum of care, that there is collecting, that's just the start. There's processing, there's description, there's providing access, there's preservation. And in the digital world, preservation is an ongoing, and it's really an interminable project, right? The technology is going to change. So I would urge everyone who's creating content or collecting content to think of a collaboration within archives, not in terms of a handoff, okay, now it's your problem, but how do you start right from the beginning to think about that entire continuum of care and realize that in many ways that the point of acquisition by an archives is the point where you have the best chance of raising the money to deal with that collection. That very often, if you give something to an archives, it is going to go into the back of a room. It is going to be set on a shelf. It's not going to be addressed because a whole bunch of other collections are coming in at the same time. So I think understanding how we might look to sharing responsibilities at an earlier and earlier point in a continuum or a life cycle of a collection is really important. The other thing I would say from the perspective of the archives is that we have to start thinking in terms of beyond the boundaries of the four walls of our archives. I mean, we have traditionally thought that everything happens, and this is certainly true of the Museum of American History and the Smithsonian, everything happens in that building. We collect it, we take care of it, we describe it, we interpret it, we assign meaning to this content. And increasingly that's not a tenable proposition for all sorts of reasons, not simply because of the budget problems, which plague me, but also in the idea that we're not just sharing information now, we're really sharing authority. It is not the role of the Smithsonian or the Museum of American History to interpret a collection. We want to be able to make that collection available for other people to interpret and other people to tell us what it means. So looking for collaborations that involve, I think, on one hand, on the financial scale, or dealing with financial level, dealing with scale, not treating problems or collections as a boutique effort that we're going to address once and somehow raise the money, but looking for ways to share infrastructure and enable us to drive down the costs. Because everything you guys have said was kind of staggering in terms of the manual labor involved. I mean, tape by tape by tape. That's a huge cost. So how do you address that? It's not going to happen in one institution and then another institution, all duplicating efforts, competing for the same funds, building the same kind of infrastructure. So those collaborations are essential. The other thing I would say in terms of, and that has to be driven by the archives and the museums and the cultural heritage institutions. The other thing I would say is, essentially that we can, take advantage of technology in the sense that a lot of the activities that have traditionally been seen as archival, those functions can be shared and should be shared, especially in terms of description and interpretation. There was a wonderful session on metadata yesterday which talked about the whole number of different ways you can collect and aggregate metadata. And a lot of them were not being done by the archivists. There's Google Forms, there's aggregation. There's a wonderful project out of Washington State run by one of my heroes, Kim Withy Mukutu, which is essentially a collections management system that allows indigenous peoples to assign values and descriptions, definitions to content that other people hold. And the variant of that is what something also Kim has worked on is traditional knowledge labels, where you can essentially, if you open up your catalog as an archives, someone else can assign content to it as well, interpretations and metadata. And so there's a whole variety of technological options that we should be actively exploring, but they're going to start on the premises that we're going to give up some of our custodial role, we're going to give up some of our traditional roles and responsibilities, and we're going to start to share not just information, which is what we've always tried to do, but share authority and, more importantly, share control. So I think there are a variety of things we could tease out, but the larger point I was going to make is it's not going to happen in one collection at a time, because we simply cannot manage the costs when we look at things like that.
Thank you. Okay, so at this point, I don't know if Ayana, you want to say anything. Ayana is trying to find a home for a collection of, how many tapes is it, 900? 900 tapes of a radio program, L'Heure Haitienne, which ran from 1969 to 2002. And I don't know, do you want to say anything about it? See if you can.
Can people, hear me?
Can you hear her? Yeah?
Oh, wow. Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Ayana Lugro. I'm a first-year PhD student in the history department at Duke. So there are definitely some overlaps between Craig and I's narrative, but I'll just open up with something out of Columbia University's Daily Spectator newspaper from April 4th, 1986. For the past 16 years, members of New York City's Haitian community have aired L'Heure Haitienne, the Haitian Hour, from Columbia's student-operated radio station WKCR. Broadcast in Creole, the show purports to keep the Haitian community in the tri-state area informed about activities in Haiti and other U.S. Haitian communities. But the show's controversial politics have brought a host of death and bomb threats, as well as threatened lawsuits against the show's inflammatory program director and broadcaster, Lionel Legros. L'Heure Haitienne's volatile leftist content has raised questions regarding the show's compliance with WKCR and Federal Communications Commission's FCC guidelines concerning the broadcasting of political editorials and monitoring procedures. Quote, in trying to serve both the New York and Columbia communities, we entered into an incredible quagmire of legal, social, linguistic, administrative, and punitive problems, said Jonathan, WKCR's station manager in 1985. So L'Heure Haitienne ran between 1969 through 2002 out of WKCR, which is Columbia University's radio station. The show was founded by a group of Haitian exiles / students and was run in Haitian Creole and at times in French and English. As the paragraph shares, this show sought to connect members of the Haitian diaspora in New York across the boroughs and disseminated news about Haitian culture and music. My interest in this project was actually an accident, in that I was speaking with one of my dad's friends, and he mentioned that these tapes were around. And obviously I knew about the show as a little girl. I often attended protests with my parents in New York City regarding issues from Amadou Diallo's death to Aristide being overthrown. and such matters. But honestly, I had forgotten about the show, similar to my family members, because of the reality that Haiti was not going to be a space that we could return to as a family. And so in just a random conversation with my dad's friend, he mentioned that these tapes were around and they're in a tool shed in Long Island. And so this summer, like most people who are interested in archival projects, I ended up in someone's garage and tool shed, kind of digging through what existed. Very similar to Craig, this interest is really driven by a desire to tell a narrative about democracy, both in the United States and Haiti. It's about Creole, it's about the diaspora, it's about living in exile. But one thing that I find incredibly unique about Le Haïtien is really kind of the desire to decolonize a university space. What does it mean to be a political radio show within a university setting, particularly like Columbia University? And so in those conversations and in my desires of wanting to donate this collection, I've come across a series of questions. Does Columbia University own these rights for the show? Do the owners or creators of the show own the rights? Does WKCR, the radio station that operates independently out of Columbia University, own the rights? And so there's so many questions in seeking to find a home for an archival collection. And I do want to share that if there's anything that this process has taught me, it's that there's a major disconnect between scholars and archivists in terms of the type of labor it takes to compose an archive. And so I've become very appreciative of, just the mere action of walking into a library and speaking with an archivist around what is around. And so if anyone has any suggestions or ways that they can support in this archive finding a home, Alejandra can share my contact information. And I want to thank you all for allowing me to join in with you on this Saturday afternoon.
Thank you. So I think we all share a lot of sort of similar concerns and interests. So I'm just going to throw it open now for all of the panelists, all of the questions for anybody who spoke even earlier. Questions, comments? Yeah.
What is the name of the collection that is being offered?
This one?
Yeah.
It's L'Heure Haïtienne.
It means the Haitian hour.
The Haitian hour. Yeah.
Questions, comments? Yeah.
Well, I can certainly add, because if I could just extend our conversation from lunch yesterday, I think, part of this collaboration can also be, as Christina said, efforts to try and, put these programs back on the air, right? And that's only a component of this preservation, I think, right? I mean, if we can bring these, these kinds of materials back to people either over the air or online, right? That's a way, that's, one way to remind people of the importance of these materials. So I think that's the other piece of the collaboration circle is, our various options. And, this may go back to some of the conversation this morning about the importance of college radio, the importance of low power FM, right? That there are these radio outlets that we might be able to utilize, right? As a way to kind of complete that circle. Right, and bring these materials back to people, which also then is a reminder of their importance. If we can deal with, as was brought up, the rights questions and some of those things that may come up, which are of course going to be part of that. But so I think there are a lot of really, great opportunities to do those kind of things. And I'll just say really quickly, I mean, my work is mostly in Argentina and Uruguay, and Radio Uruguay is actually doing this great thing where they're bringing back old
radionovelas, not super old, but from the 60s and 70s, putting them back on the air and putting them up on their website. So with information, with some documentation. I mean, so they're bringing it back and you know, using it as content, but also as a way of kind of reminding people of you know, bringing some of those historical materials back into people's consciousness. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that can be done there in the right situation.
Thanks. Yeah.
Bob Gordon.
In terms of, you know, preservation, thank you. In terms of preservation, I was wondering if there's other strategies besides, you know, room temperature rooms and so forth in terms of tapes, because I'm just thinking about all the various different, particularly in the area that I'm working in terms of Spanish language, bilingual, indigenous programming, that sometimes is not even located in a radio station, but it's just a program that happens once a week or once a month. And so trying to think about how do we preserve those programs that don't even have a bigger infrastructure, if there's any strategies that you can offer that folks might be able to take back to be able to utilize, you know, that can still be sort of DIY, or that, you know, that doesn't have to be so labor or capital, you know, intensive.
Right. Well, two things. I mean, for older content, the content that's on analog media, I don't think there's an easy answer. I mean, you are looking at some kind of a migration or digitization process that is going to cost some amount of money. There's, I think, from this point forward approach to contents that's being created now that could you know, reasonably, and this could be you know, an interesting project, is to start setting up some sort of, I hate to use the term best practices because that usually means really expensive practices, but some, you know, more appropriate practices that will allow people to sort of understand, if we want to preserve this, here are some things we should do at this point, the point of creation, that'll make all of those necessary migrations, et cetera, simpler and less expensive. And I think that would be relatively easy to do. Especially in audio, where you know, we really kind of understand the digital world. Video is a little more difficult; it's still kind of the Wild West. But in the audio world, I think we could set up a variety of suggestions and guidelines that would lower the costs ultimately of preservation, would make the handoffs much simpler and easier to achieve. But as far as analog goes, that's still costly. I don't know any other ways around that.
Hi, it's such an interesting panel. Thank you. If there's anything that I've kind of learned the last 2 days is the significance of undergrads, grad students, and interns in radio preservation. There's this need for them to do this manual labor that was also mentioned on this panel, which, yes, provides a learning experience, and they get compensated with credits and learning experience, but it's also, we look to them for cheap labor in some way, right? But I think this is the one panel, particularly your comments, that kind of made me feel that we could shift some of the collaboration dynamics with that. And by saying that once you share collaboration, you share authority. So this idea of including everybody, not just people who tap into the archives, but kind of acknowledging who found them, who's cataloging them, who's cleaning them, right? I think it'd be really interesting to kind of rethink preservation by including everybody that is a part of every single step, right? Not just the person who authors the ultimate paper or something like that. So it was a very thought-provoking panel. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to jump onto that because I've been thinking as everybody's been speaking, including the first panel and then ours and then your comments as well, is that what it strikes me that one of the things about these two panels is decolonization, right? And decolonizing radio studies, decolonizing the radio, and all of that. And as much as I liked the first two talks by Michelle Helms and Susan Douglas, that's not one of the sort of priorities that they set for radio studies. And I think that we really need to make a push for that in terms of just look at where we are in the program, look at how they've put us opposite, African American studies, which we would actually benefit from all going to that panel. So I think that there's a real need to kind of keep pushing. So yeah, and especially in terms of what Robert said about deauthorizing the archive and things like that as well. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Broader priorities that are happening within the task force.
Yeah.
And about what exactly it is that we're doing here.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that those are bigger questions of also power that that are not really being addressed, but that we are sort of underlying a lot of what's being discussed.
Yeah, I agree.
Can I chime in on that a little bit?
Yeah.
I think whether or not we get a second grant for our Radio Haiti stuff, we're going to explore the YouTube possibility for putting the collection on there, which obviously there are a lot of technical problems with that, but we've talked to YouTube a little bit and they're interested in supporting that. And the idea, of course, is to be rebroadcasting that material in Haiti. That's essentially what we'd be doing. But to your question about DIY, I love DIY, and as an archivist in a big institution, it's not a real popular stance because we have all sorts of standards that we have to really hew to. But there are a lot of tools out there now that you can use with some risks, but I got to tell you that there are risks in an institutional archive like my own as well that you need to take into account. But between YouTube, Google Drive, Amazon Cloud, the things that can be done DIY to keep your stuff safe, if you do it with a design, is something that is actually possible today. The tools are there. And I occasionally teach an oral history workshop, and I have people come in from the community, or small historical societies, and they ask me this question, like, what can we do? And I say, well, there are a lot of tools out there, and they know what the tools are, but the important part is to have a plan. And the standards for metadata that we use are really readily available, and they can be used for any collection. It doesn't have to just be in a library. So I really encourage DIY if it's done in a way that has a design behind it, because if that material ends up going to an institutional archive like Duke or someplace like that, that gives us a real leg up in the process of trying to move those materials into the archive. Even if every T isn't crossed and I isn't dotted, it really helps us. And I think I actually had this conversation with Ayana as well about some basic tools that can be used. So,
I don't know if this is if I am going to express it in quite the way that'll make sense, but I know one of the points that was made earlier in the morning session too was the talk about how important global radio is because it's so valuable in third world countries. But the truth is that within the United States, it's very valuable to communities of color. And that's one thing too that, I've heard in going to the different sessions. And the value of making sure that that's archived is because they were worried about the future of radio. But the truth is that radio is effective tool right now in communities of color. And that's not going to change too soon, because when you look at areas like Eastern Washington, there is also a digital divide. So it's not like everybody has access, to internet or podcasts or internet radio. It's radio that's the effective tool, and it's radio that goes out into, the agricultural fields and as Ines mentioned, that the one that you hear in restaurants and so forth. So it's still a very viable and important means of mass communication for communities of color in this country.
I actually, this is such an interesting idea, the idea of putting archives back on the air. I'm letting it kind of stew and sit with me, because there's some Mexican radio programs from the 1920s, 30s that I don't want to get that back on the air now, right? And there is such a struggle to have fresh, contemporary programming, something that was not used previously on Spanish language broadcast radio, at least in the United States, that I'm just having it stew a little bit. In the Cuba Radio Telenovelas, I actually heard a presentation from Jada Rivero, who has done a preliminary analysis of some of those shows. and she does amazing archival work. Her analysis was amazing, but she gave a wonderful political kind of racial analysis of that Cuban radio telenovela. And I'm not sure if you replayed that today, how listeners would react, because the political context is so different and depending on the listeners. So I'm kind of thinking of what little I know of that archive and how excited Spanish language radio listeners are. You know, I'm thinking of like, even when Laura here, the 70s, when Latin File was on the air, how that was politically significant because it was something fresh and contemporary, and it wasn't something that somebody pulled out. Because I think people automatically think, oh, it's because of budget cuts or there's nothing else to fill in the content of it, kind of thing. So I love the idea of it, but I'm letting it stew with all these other kind of factors that I'm kind of thinking about, FYI.
Thank you. So I'm Laura Sorobarra, and I work at NPR, and I manage the archives and our digitization labs. And two things I want to say, one about interns and doing in-house digitization, and going to the point of equipment being very difficult to find. The way we did it, I have 20 students now. I ask listservs and I emailed groups of engineers, broadcast engineers, public radio people, to ask, do you have any students in your garage, in your basement, whatever? Can you give it to me in any shape or form? And I got 15. And we had about 2 or 3, and then now I got more. So in total, I have 20. We are cannibalizing each one, and we are making new ones out of, we refurbish them. So that gave us a very good beginning for our lab. So far, in 2 years, we have digitized 45,000 hours on CD and reels, mostly reels. About interns, we use, I have 2 staff, audio engineers, 2 audio engineers, audio specialists, and we work with up to 3 interns per term. So if I find the right candidate, I will have 9 interns in 1 year. But yes, they are not cheap labor, they are students, but they are getting lots of knowledge. And the way I see it, I am preparing audiovisual people for the field, because in the future, all of you will have to be digitizing, all of us in this conference here. Eventually, those archives will have to be. And you know what, I feel we will have lots of experts, because what they are doing in our labs is high scale. We do sometimes 48 tapes in 1 day. So that is 48 hours. And the other good things, most of these students are women. So we are getting women in the field as well.
Anything else? I guess it's almost time to be done. I just had an idea as we were talking that maybe we do this a little bit informally, but maybe we should have a listserv that anybody in this room can join, and we can sort of keep this conversation going, so it's not just doesn't just happen once a year. So maybe if you just want to come up and write your name down and see if I can sort of create a list or whatever it is, that I think that would be really useful. But I just want to thank both panels, everybody on the panels, for coming and sharing and talking today. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.